Lam Chi Phat, the Chronicle of an Overseas Chinese Family. In the autumn of 1939, Lam Chi had a difficult decision to make. A decision of life or death. Earlier in the summer, he had encountered a fortune teller who, after analyzing Lam Chi's astrology chart, told him that he would have difficulty living through that year, but if he did survive, he would live well past his 70s or even 80s. He was 50 years old. Lam Chi was quite puzzled by what the fortune teller had told him. Sometimes it kept him awake at night. Should he believe it and prepare for the worst or just ignore it? Several weeks later he told his wife and elder children about the encounter. They all told him that it was nonsense, that he should not believe the man, but Lam Chi sensed that the fortune teller had accurately predicted his fate. If he had to die, there were two reasons why he would prefer to die and be buried in his home village in China. First, he wanted to be buried near his parents because of the traditional Chinese notion of the fallen leaves always go back to their roots. Second, he wanted to be buried in a dry place, because in the place he was then, he had often seen that the underground in most graveyards was wet, and that troubled him a lot. The idea of returning home had tormented him for several weeks because China was at war with Japan and the trip home would be a long one. Finally, early in October 1939, he decided to go back to China. 1 week before his departure, he sat down and talked with his wife. "Mother of my children, I love you so much, but I have to go. If everything goes well, I will be back after the Chinese New Year. If not, then take care of yourself and the children for me. Let our eldest son handle the family business, he is really good at that. He will become a very successful businessman. As long as he is in charge, I have no worry." Then Lam Chi set off for China. He never came back. My grandfather, Lam Chi, was born in 1890 in the small floating grass village, near Chaoyang, about 35 miles from Shantou in the province of Guangdong, China. He was the youngest of 3 sons of a poor family of Teo Chew descent. In his early memory, he and his 2 brothers always had to fight hunger. His mother told him later that the first few years after his birth were the most difficult time for the family. During that period, oftentimes my great-grandmother had to drag along her 2 older sons and carry my grandfather on her back in a cotton sling, to go begging for food on the streets, because my great-grandfather could not earn enough to feed the family, and besides, he smoked opium. Some days she would come back home with no food at all, other days, the food was just enough to feed the children. My grandfather had no memory of his father because he died when my grandfather was very young. During his childhood, he never had a chance to go to school because the family was too poor. He was illiterate all his life. In those years, the Qing dynasty was almost at its end, and the rotten Chinese government was so weak that every foreign country wanted to have a piece of China. Foreign encroachment intensified after the Opium War and the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. The French captured Cochin China, and the British colonized Hong Kong and Kowloon with a 99-year lease. The Chinese economy was strangled by all sorts of unfair treaties. Life was very difficult, especially in remote villages, and people suffered from wars, diseases and famine. More than 2 million people left China from 1850 until the end of the 19th century, some going to Southeast Asia, others going as far as North America because of the dream of the Gold Mountain, our version of the Promised Land. At the beginning of the 1900s, several of my grandfather's friends and relatives in the village had gone to Vietnam. He heard that life was better and easier in this new place, whereas in China, he had difficulty even finding some odd jobs to support the family, and his 2 brothers fared no better. Seeing that there was no future in his native village, my grandfather was tempted to go to Vietnam. Finally, just prior to the fall of the Qing dynasty, he boarded a merchant ship at Shantou, one of the earliest Chinese ports opened to the outside world, especially Southeast Asia, and sailed off to Vietnam. He was so poor that he was dressed only in a tank top and shorts, and carried a small bag of belongings. He settled down in a small town called Cai Rang, literally means the tooth in Vietnamese, about 4 miles from the city of Can Tho in the heart of the Mekong Delta, one of the world's biggest rice-growing areas. Can Tho was the capital city of the then Phong Dinh province located about 100 miles southwest of Saigon. In Vietnam it was also nicknamed the capital of the West, because it was considered as the most important city for the whole southwestern part of the country. Cai Rang was a small town with a population of about 2,000 people, composed of mainly Vietnamese and Chinese of Teo Chew descent coming mostly from the area of Shantou. The most important trade for the Chinese in this township was rice. Surprisingly, it was Cai Rang and not Can Tho, which had the largest concentration of rice merchants in the whole province. This was because Cai Rang was situated in the center of all the rice fields in the region, and its numerous waterways made it easy for rice barges to travel and to unload their contents. The merchants would go buy paddy rice at the remote villages, and then send it to some small rice husking mills at Can Tho or some bigger ones in Saigon for processing, since there was no rice mill at Cai Rang at that time. Upon arriving at Cai Rang, my grandfather worked at several odd jobs ranging from rower to coolie and even carrying water with a shoulder pole for some rich families. He not only supported himself but also tried to save some money to send back home in order to help his mother and brothers, for life was still very difficult there. One day he went to the market and saw a young lady sitting on a small, low stool, selling Vietnamese pastries on a stand. His stomach growled with hunger, for he had not had breakfast that morning, so he dropped by and bought some pastries. While the young lady was preparing his order, he looked at her and thought to himself, if I marry this young beautiful girl, I may have pastries all day long and will never be hungry again, which is one of the main reasons why I came to Vietnam, right? The memory of days of hunger in China was still fresh in his mind. He started to make frequent visits to the stand of that young lady. Every day she would carry her 2 big baskets of pastries with a yoke and would set up her stand at the Cai Rang open-air bazaar, and he would oftentimes intentionally skip his breakfast and go buy pastries from her. 2 years later, he married that young girl, Trang Thi Hai, who became my grandmother. During the first year of their marriage, my grandparents had to share a house with one of my grandmother's friends because they had no money to rent a house of their own. Soon after, my grandfather went to work for a wealthy rice merchant who had the same surname, and who had also come from the same region as his a decade earlier. The merchant owned the biggest house in town. My grandfather first worked as a cook, then learned the rice trade and became a weigher for their rice business, his main function buying and weighing paddy rice. He made friends with the merchant's bookkeeper, Tan Ngôn Kui, who had a handsome handwriting, and who also came from the same region in China. By the time their first child, a daughter, my first aunt, was born a year later, my grandparents had saved enough money to rent a small wooden house across the Cai Rang River, at the other side of the town. Several years later, they bought that house. That was my grandfather's first house in this new country. Meanwhile, my grandmother continued with her pastry business to supplement my grandfather's income. When my first aunt was 9 or 10, she started helping my grandmother by carrying a small basketful of pastries on her head to the market and looking after the stand when my grandmother was away. Later she would even take care of the stand by herself while my grandmother stayed home to make pastries and take care of her other children. During the mid-1920s, my grandfather started thinking of striking out on his own and borrowed some money from friends to set up his own rice business. By then my grandmother had given up the pastry stand and opened a fabric shop at the Cai Rang covered marketplace in the town center. Shortly after, she even gave up that shop and joined my grandfather in his new venture. Oftentimes they had to leave home for several days to go deep into remote areas in the Mekong Delta such as Phung Heap, Phong Dinh or Rach Goi to buy paddy rice and transport it out to some small rice mills at Can Tho for processing. The work was hard but they made money. My grandfather started sending more money back home to help his family in China. By that time, my great-grandmother had long since stopped begging. With the money that my grandfather provided her, she had more than enough to feed the whole family in China, but she never forgot her days as a beggar. Therefore, every day there was always a pot of hot rice porridge, the traditional meal, especially breakfast, for all Teo Chew people, in her house ready for any passing beggars or poor people whom she saw needed help. The beggars from the nearby villages as well as her own would even come to her house and ask for a hot bowl of porridge from time to time. She always told my grandfather that during her years of begging, one of the most painful situations to endure was standing in the cold wind. A bowl of hot rice porridge would help the beggars to warm up their stomach and withstand the hardship of the cold. Every time my grandmother went back to China to visit her, my great-grandmother would ask her to bring fabrics, wheat flour, etc., so that she could distribute it to her poor acquaintances. When she died in 1935, my grandfather was at her side. During the burial ceremony, there were a few dozen poor people and beggars from the nearby villages who had come to pay their last respects. My grandfather didn't know them, but in bad times they had received goodness from my great-grandmother. They even pooled together and bought several whole uncooked pigs, white pork, so called because at that time unless they went to Shantou, there was no shop in the village that knew how to prepare the traditional Chinese roast pork. These were their offerings to my great-grandmother. My grandfather was deeply touched by their generosity and finally began to understand the extent of her kindness. By custom, my grandfather didn't keep the offerings. After the ceremony he returned them, and in addition, he added an envelope of money to thank them. Because of the hardships that his mother had suffered during his early years, my grandfather said to himself that one day, if he became rich, he would build a shrine to commemorate her memory. According to custom in China at that time, building a joss house was the highest honor that an offspring could pay to commemorate an ancestor. Later, he mentioned this desire to his children, especially to my first uncle. My first uncle, Lam Nhu, was born in 1916, the year of the dragon, a good year in the Chinese calendar. My grandfather was happy, because by tradition every Chinese man wanted to have at least one son to carry on the family line. When my first uncle was old enough to go to school, my grandfather took him along on one of his trips back to China so that he could go to school in his home village in China. There was no Chinese school at Kai Rang at that time, and my first uncle was too young to attend school at Kentho by himself. At his home village, at least the family in China could look after him. My grandfather always wanted his children to receive a Chinese education. Another and more important reason that my grandfather wanted to take my first uncle back to China was by that time, my grandfather had married a second wife in China. She was my mainland grandmother, as the overseas Chinese used to call them to distinguish them from their counterparts who lived overseas. My grandfather wanted his overseas wife's first son to be raised for a period of time by his mainland wife in order to strengthen the family ties. Later he did the same with my third uncle who was born in China and who was the first son of my mainland grandmother. My grandfather had him taken to Vietnam when he was about 8 or 9 to be raised by my grandmother. He had painstakingly arranged this interlacing relationship to unify our family. Later, when my mainland grandmother was in difficulty under the communist regime in China, my grandfather having passed away a decade earlier, my first uncle was the one who kept sending money back home to support her. Later, when my first uncle went back to Vietnam, he was sent to attend the Franco-Chinese school in Saigon, later renamed Fraternity High School, where he studied Chinese and French. Meanwhile, by their hard work and luck, my grandparents had accumulated a small fortune. The family was growing bigger, too. They had had another daughter, my second aunt, and then my father, Lam Kich, their second son, was born in 1921. The month my father was born, the wife of my grandfather's bookkeeper friend, who had given birth to their third son several months before, died. The loss of his mother and her nourishing milk caused the little baby to cry and cry. Seeing that, my grandmother asked their friend to bring the child to our house, where she could nurse him when she nursed her own baby. She took care of the child for 3 months until he was old enough to eat rice porridge. The bookkeeper later became my maternal grandfather, and the child my maternal third uncle, Chan Chung King, who later became an associate professor at Pennsylvania State University. My mother, Tran An, her last name was Vietnamized, was born 4 years later to my maternal grandfather's mainland wife in China. It seemed that heaven had decided our destiny by having the child came to our house to be nursed at the same time with my father. Several years after the death of his wife in Vietnam, my maternal grandfather went back to China taking all of his children. He never set foot in Vietnam again. Since my grandfather was illiterate, education was very important to him. Seeing that there was no Chinese school at Kai Rang to provide schooling for the children of Chinese families, he started campaigning to build a Chinese elementary school. With other rich Chinese families in town, he raised funds and organized its first board of directors, of which he became the chairman. They bought a piece of land near the main road which connected Kai Rang to Can Tho, and the first and only Chinese elementary school in town, Tan Tru School, was built in the mid-1920s. My father was the first child of the family to attend that school, then followed most of his younger sisters and brothers, and later, myself and my younger brothers, my only sister and many of our cousins. When my grandfather became richer, not only did he contribute to the school in town, but he also was active in other community affairs such as the maintenance of the town's only Chinese Teo Chew temple. He also started bringing some of his brother's children from China and offered them jobs at Kai Rang. Meanwhile, my grandparents were expanding their business little by little. Since there weren't many rice mills at Can Tho big enough to handle their business, they started renting barges and transporting paddy rice to Saigon for processing. Then they bought their first barge, then the second, and finally, by 1930, they had a total of 3 barges of 200 tons each. During that time my first uncle started to follow my grandfather to learn the trade, going with him to buy paddy rice in the countryside and accompanying him to Saigon to deal with the rice mills. My grandmother stayed home to take care of her other children, which had increased in number. After my father, there were my third aunt, fourth aunt, fifth aunt, fourth uncle, who died when he was still very young, and later sixth uncle, seventh uncle, and finally my little aunt, altogether 11 children. And that was not yet counting the children that my grandfather had with my mainland grandmother. She had given birth to my third uncle, fifth uncle, and my little uncle. Even though she had so many children, my grandmother took care of each one of them with all the necessary attention. One year, when my fifth aunt was about 8 or so, she contracted a strange disease that not only made her sick but also caused a loss of hair. My grandmother took her to many doctors and even tried some Chinese medicines to no avail. Some of her friends told her that it might be because of the acclimatization problem that the Chinese called the disharmony of water and soil. My grandmother then decided to move with my fifth aunt to the house of an aunt in Bin Tui, a small town about 7 miles from Kai Rang, where they stayed for half a year, with no improvement. She then decided to take her to China for a change. They went back in 1935 and stayed for a year, and surprisingly, my fifth aunt was cured. My grandmother was also a brave woman who didn't give up easily. One night, she had turned off the oil lamp in the living room and was preparing to go to bed, when suddenly someone broke into the room and tried to steal her gold bracelets. While the man struggled to pull the bracelets off her wrist, she resisted by grabbing his wrist with one hand, and with the other, she pulled out a hairpin from her bun and cut his face. Seeing that he was fighting a stronger opponent, the robber ran away. The whole event happened in the dark. My grandmother didn't know who the robber was, but she was certain that it must be someone who knew her. The next morning she reported the matter to her elder brother, who happened to be the chief administrator of the Chao Tan district at the time. After an investigation, the robber was caught. It was also during this period that my grandparents started investing in real estate. They had to expand their existing house to 8 separate units to accommodate the number of children. In addition, they bought houses and lands and rice fields. They owned a dozen houses at Kai Rang alone and hundreds of acres of rice fields in some remote areas of the Mekong Delta such as Kin Kung, Rach Goi and Kai Tak. My grandfather also sent money back home to build houses for his 2 brothers and mother in China, as well as buying lands there. By 1935, my grandfather saw that my first uncle was very keen in business dealings and let him manage the whole operation in Saigon. He himself took care of buying paddy rice in the Mekong Delta and sent it to Saigon by boat. From there my first uncle would handle the rest. By this time, they supplied rice to a large part of the southern country, and my first uncle started looking to expand the market by exporting. He came into contact with a French trading company named A.B. David, whose owner, Monsieur David, as he used to be called, was a Jewish businessman. My first uncle started selling rice to A.B. David for export to Singapore and Hong Kong. He made friends with the deputy of Monsieur David, Nguyen Kim An, a tall and strong gentleman 1 year his elder, whom people used to call respectfully Sixth Master Kim An, sixth, for he was the sixth child of his family, and master, for he was always helping people with their legal problems. My first uncle was of medium height with a full belly, a typical Chinese businessman type. Sixth Master held the title of comprador, the Spanish term for buyer, and was responsible for quality control of the rice as well as other products that A.B. David exported. His integrity in the fulfillment of his duty won the trust and respect of my first uncle, and vice versa. Their great friendship lasted for the next 50 years. The export market gave the family business a big boost, and my first uncle became quite a well-known rice merchant in Saigon. Also by this time, he had married his first wife, a girl from a nearby village in China whom he had never met before, who had been chosen and ordered by my great-grandmother. It was also during this period that my mainland grandmother went to visit my grandfather for the first time in Vietnam, with my third uncle, her first child. She stayed for a year and went back to China afterward, leaving behind my third uncle to be raised by my grandmother. My first uncle liked his third brother very much. After studying at Cai Rang's Tan Tru School for a couple of years, he sent him to Saigon to attend middle school. One day in 1937, my grandfather's former employer, who had the same surname as his, and who owned the biggest house in town, came to visit him. After a customary chatting and talking about the rice business, his guest explained the reason for his visit. Lam Chi, to be honest with you, you know that my family has started to ebb and my financial situation is not as good as it used to be. I want to sell my big house. He paused for a second, my grandfather nodded without uttering a word. But I don't want to sell it to just anyone, he went on, I only want to sell it to a Lam family. He was a very strong Chinese traditionalist. My grandfather nodded in agreement but kept his silence. That is why I come to see you today, he continued. You know, Lam Chi, my house is the biggest in town. In Cai Rang now, you are the only Lam family who is rich enough to buy my house. Do you want to buy it? Well, it's an honor that you have thought of me, my grandfather said. I have to think about it. Your house is a very big and good one. I have to discuss this with my wife. I will give you a fair price, don't worry. I just want to sell it to a Lam family, and no one else. Because of the number of children that my grandparents had and the increase of the business activities at Cai Rang, my grandparents decided to buy the house. After some negotiating, they bought the house for 12,000 piastres. At that time, 1 piastre could buy about 110 pounds of paddy rice. It was a lot of money. By 1938, we had become the biggest rice merchants at Cai Rang. Every day, farmers from the remote areas of Mekong Delta would come out to sell paddy rice to us. We would buy almost everything available. Our big house had 3 large warehouses that we used to store paddy rice before sending it to Saigon for processing. Some of the rice fields that we owned were rented to the peasants, who paid rent with their crops and sold the rest to us. At harvest time, the 3 storehouses were full of paddy rice. There were a dozen people working in our house, including several live-in maids and nannies to take care of my aunts and uncles who were still very young. Every day at lunchtime, the cook had to prepare a meal to feed 2 big tables of 12 people each. By that time, my first uncle had also rented a 2-story building located at 207 Le Quang Lim Street in the 6th district of Saigon. The ground floor of the building served as office and warehouse, the second as lodgings. It faced a river about 100 feet wide. My third aunt and third uncle were studying in Saigon at the time and lived there. The rice mill that my first uncle rented to process the paddy rice was right across the river. When it was running at full capacity, the bran dust flew all over the place, even crossing the river to our rented house. My third uncle had to dust his desk every day. Because of the increased activities at Kai Rang, my third aunt, who was 15 at the time and who was attending a grade 5 class in Saigon, was called back home to be the treasurer of the family. She became the key holder of the 3 safes, yes 3, in the house where my grandparents kept their money, land and house deeds and other valuables, especially gold, because back then, gold had a more secure value than paper money. Anyone, including her elder sisters and brothers, who wanted spending money would have to go see her. My father, who was her elder brother and who was a big spender, would always have arguments with her when he needed money. When he was taking too much, she would ask him to get permission from my grandparents. Despite her young age, she became unintentionally the manager of the house, helping my grandmother take care of the daily chores and supervise the maids. Her position was strengthened by the fact that she was the keeper of the keys. My grandfather even asked her to carry big sums of money alone. At that time, since we were doing a lot of business in Saigon, from time to time she would travel by bus to Saigon and bring back suitcases of money while my grandfather and father would wait at the Cantho ferry for her arrival. She was so important to the family that my grandmother didn't want her to get married too early, whereas that was the norm for girls at the time. When she had a boyfriend later and went out with him, my grandmother even had my 6th uncle, who was about 7 or 8 years old, follow her by bicycle in order to check on her, because she held all the money of the family. She wasn't married until much later after she had returned to China in 1945. My 4th aunt, her younger sister, was married long before her. After that fateful encounter with the fortune teller in the summer of 1939, my grandfather left Vietnam in October to return to his home village in China. The Second World War had just begun, although China had already been at war with Japan for more than 2 years. The fighting was fierce in some parts of the country, especially after the infamous Nanjing massacre, where more than 300,000 Chinese men, women and children were cold-bloodedly raped and slaughtered by the Japanese during the first 3 months of 1938. The Japanese occupied several big cities such as Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing down to Guangzhou in Guangdong province, but they didn't control the countryside. The waterway from Saigon to Shantou that my grandfather used to take when he went back to China was very dangerous due to frequent torpedo attacks, so he decided to travel by land. He went up to Hanoi in the north, then crossed the border and headed home via Guangxi province. It was a long and laborious trip, because at that time, the buses only connected the main cities. Even traveling from Kai Rang to Cantho, people used to take the horse cart. My 7th uncle, whose favorite game during classes recess had been shooting birds with his slingshots, remember that when he was very young, my grandmother would not allow him to go to Cantho alone, and never wanted to give him money for the trip. He would usually slip into the back of a horse cart for a free ride, then jump down when the cart owner noticed his presence. On his way up to the north, my grandfather made a brief stop in Saigon to say goodbye to my first uncle and to remind him to take care of the family and business during his absence. He also gave him some advice in case he did not come back. Then he set out for the long journey. In some parts of China, the Japanese had destroyed villages and bombed roads. Sometimes my grandfather would stay in villages which had only a few households left. The trip took almost 2 months. After arriving home in early December, he developed a toothache. My grandfather was also an opium smoker, like his father. Several years earlier, he had climbed up on a pile of rice bags to do some adjustment and accidentally fell down from the top, hurting one of his legs. Even after medical treatment, he was in great pain, which his friends insisted that opium could alleviate. That was how he became addicted to opium. For several days, he used one of his metal opium smoking tools to stir his aching tooth, and somehow that had caused a tumor in his neck that was running with pus. My mainland grandmother didn't know what to do, and just tried to drain the pus with cotton puffs. 2 weeks later, exactly 1 month prior to the Chinese New Year, the infection killed my grandfather. The family in Vietnam received the news just a couple of days before the New Year. In the beginning my grandmother didn't believe it, but after verifying with relatives in China, she finally accepted the fact. Because of the war, there was no way for the whole family to return to China to bury my grandfather. Instead, my grandmother asked her mainland counterpart to preserve the corpse in a casket and wait for the return of the whole family from Vietnam for the burial. That casket was kept in a small room at the back of our house in China for almost 9 years. Believe it or not, the coffin was so well made that it didn't smell at all during the whole period. Meanwhile at Kai Rang, because we were already a well-known and distinguished family, my grandmother organized a grandiose burial ceremony for my grandfather without actually burying him. After my grandfather's death, my first uncle took over the whole business operation. With the help of my third aunt, they tried to manage the business as usual. Everything was running normally until the Japanese bombarded Saigon and took over Vietnam. Even though they occupied Vietnam during World War II, the Japanese still allowed the French to keep the nominal administrative control of the country because the Vichy government of France had collaborated with the Germans, who had become a Japanese ally. The same privilege was accorded to the French concessions in China during this period. At that time, Monsieur David decided to withdraw temporarily from all business activities and leave Vietnam. At the same time, many Chinese business people also decided to abandon Saigon and withdraw to the Mekong Delta areas or at least send their family down there, for it was more peaceful in the rear. My first uncle stayed there until a surprising event occurred one day several months after the Japanese occupation. He received a visit from the commander of the Japanese troops in Saigon. The commander invited him to be the chairperson of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in Saigon and asked him to lead and reorganize the Chinese business community in order to do business with Japan. One of the main reasons that the Japanese had invaded Southeast Asia was commercial. Japan lacked natural resources and depended greatly on the West for its supply of oil, metal, etc. Even during the beginning of the Second World War, Japan imported oil and steel from the U.S. to support its war with China until the U.S. embargo imposed in July 1940. With the idea of the so-called Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan wanted Southeast Asia because these countries were the producers of rice, rubber, metal, etc. By occupying Southeast Asia, Japan also tried to cut off supplies to China from these countries, namely Vietnam and Burma, which could consequently help Japan to win the war sooner. My first uncle declined the invitation politely because he didn't want to become what the Chinese called a Han traitor, a Chinese who collaborated with the Japanese. Even after his refusal, the Japanese commander kept coming back and repeating his request. That put my first uncle in a very difficult and dangerous dilemma, because he didn't want to irritate the commander. Finally he decided to abandon Saigon, too, and went back to Kai Rang in order to get away from the commander. He thought he had escaped, but 2 weeks later, he received a surprise visit at our house. The commander had come down from Saigon especially to make his final request. He even brought the general manager of the Mitsubishi Bank in Saigon with him in order to convince my first uncle that he would be supported by the Mitsubishi Bank in his dealing with the Japanese companies. My sixth uncle vividly remembered the long samurai sword that the commander wore. It impressed him so much that he always remembered the event even if he had been too young to understand what was going on. That showed how the Japanese commander had appreciated my first uncle's reputation in Saigon at the time, even though my first uncle was only in his mid-20s. My first uncle had no choice but to thank his visitors and tell them that he would not be able to accept their invitation because my grandfather had passed away and he had come back home to take care of the family business at Kai Rang. That was a very good excuse, but that would also consequently restrict his sphere of action. He would not be able to go back to Saigon to do business, at least not while the commander was still there. The commander had no other choice but to accept his refusal. Several months later, one of my first uncle's peers in Saigon whom he knew very well accepted the position. When the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the man committed suicide because of public opinion and pressures from the Chinese business community. After coming back to Kai Rang, my first uncle kept working in the rice business, albeit at a smaller scale. The export market had suffered because of the war, but the domestic one kept booming. He also assumed, by Chinese tradition, the role of my grandfather in educating and taking care of those of his sisters and brothers who were still very young. Every evening he would supervise them in their homework. The teaching then was still the old-fashioned way. He would ask my aunts and uncles to memorize and recite their lessons, and reprimand the ones who could not do it. He was very strict in their home training. If one had dirty toes, he would even brush and wash them. At that time the Mekong Delta areas became exceptionally animated and prosperous, especially at Can though. Many Chinese business people along with their families, having heard what the Japanese had done in China, had decided to retreat to the south, instead of collaborating with the Japanese. At Kai Rang, Tan Tru Elementary School even opened classes at middle school level for the newcomers from Saigon because there were qualified teachers who had come down with the retreating crowds. The middle school classes lasted until the end of the war. Nearing the end of the war, on their retreat from Vietnam, a squad of Japanese soldiers passed by Kai Rang and stayed for a couple of weeks. Seeing that we had 3 big warehouses, they asked to be allowed to use one of them as their temporary lodgings, and my grandmother had no other choice but to accept their request. They stayed for about 2 weeks. After the war, the British were the first of the Allied armies to land on Vietnamese soil, and soon put the French back in power. Because of his refusal to cooperate with the Japanese during the war, my first uncle's reputation had increased tremendously within the Chinese business community, so he decided then to return to Saigon in order to rebuild and expand his business. Monsieur David did the same. My first uncle started exploring new opportunities in Cambodia by sending my father to Phnom Penh to set up the operation there. Meantime his business was thriving in Saigon, so he decided to set up a rice mill at one of our 3 storehouses at Kai Rang, the first rice mill at Kai Rang. By 1947, my first uncle was responsible for almost half of the rice exported from Vietnam. He was so well known in Saigon that he was given by his peers in the rice trade circle the nickname of the King of Rice. It was also during this period that he decided to build the shrine for my great-grandmother, the wish of my grandfather. Now that he had money, he wanted to fulfill his father's dream. He sent my third aunt and his first wife back to China at the end of 1945 to supervise the building of the shrine. It took almost 2 years to build, and when it was finished in 1947, he made a special trip to China for the inaugural ceremony. By this time he had also married a second wife in Vietnam. 1947 also marked the year that many of my aunts and uncles went back to China. By now, we were almost the only family left at Kai Rang who still could afford, financially speaking, to maintain a link with China. Other Chinese families had either cut off their contact with China or had never returned to their home country since they had settled in Vietnam. Especially for the second generation, it cost a fortune to make the trip. First, my third uncle was sent back to prepare for the rice business that my first uncle wanted to set up in China. My first uncle sent money back home and asked my third uncle to buy a building at Shantou on Yong'an Street, which the local people called the Rice Shops Street because of the high concentration of rice merchants on it. Later he would export rice to Shantou via Hong Kong, the operation lasting until the Chinese Communists took over China in 1949. During the whole period, my third uncle was the right-hand man for our operation in China. In November of the same year, it was my grandmother's turn to go back with my father, taking along my sixth and seventh uncle as well as my fifth and little aunt, because my father was to meet my mother for the first time. Their wedding in March of 1948 was the most sumptuous amongst all those of the sisters and brothers. It was organized by my paternal and maternal uncles. The wedding banquet with over 200 guests was held in a restaurant. My uncles lit up a bundle of firecrackers reaching from the 5th floor of the restaurant down to the ground. The bundle of firecrackers cost 1,000 Hong Kong dollars at the time, and it took almost an hour for the whole bundle to be consumed. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the Viet Minh, the predecessor of the Vietnamese Communists, had started an open war with the French for the independence of Vietnam. This was after the French had bombarded the port of Haiphong in November 1946, killing over 6,000 people. By that time, my grandmother had helped the Viet Minh for several years without knowing it. She was a good-hearted person who would help any poor person, because she was once poor herself. She would oftentimes give rice to some poor peasants living near our rice fields in the remote countryside. When she rented her rice fields to the farmers and they couldn't pay their full rent because of a meager harvest season, she would take only what they could afford and sometimes even forgive the rent completely. She didn't know many of them were members of the Viet Minh, and besides, due to her illiteracy, she didn't even know what Viet Minh was. When the fighting between the two parties escalated and the toll of dead increased, some of the Viet Minh families were so poor that they couldn't even afford a coffin, and my grandmother would give them money to buy one. Only much later did she find out that they worked for the Viet Minh, but my grandmother kept helping those families because she took pity on them. An event happened in the summer of 1947 that somewhat changed my grandmother's mind. That summer, my first uncle had partnered with a dozen smaller rice merchants at Cai Rang to go buy paddy rice at Phong Dinh. Many of them had contracted loans guaranteed by my first uncle. They organized a team of barges to go transport paddy rice from Phong Dinh out to Cai Rang. The barges were tied together with lines and traveled in file. Somehow midway out to Cai Rang, the Viet Minh sabotaged several barges, but all the barges sank. Because they were secured together, the bargemen couldn't cut the lines in time to release the undamaged ones. There was a full load of paddy rice on each barge. The water of the river was contaminated for more than a week. That year we suffered a big loss as my first uncle had to pay off all the guaranteed loans. After my parents' wedding, my grandmother stayed on with the children in China because it was time to bury my grandfather. The casket was still in the small room at the back of our house, but my mother was not aware of that. One day, she went to the back of the house looking for some kitchenware. Opening the door of a small room, she saw a blood-red coffin inside. She was stunned. That was when she found out the whole story, and from that day until my grandfather was buried, she dared not go to the back of the house by herself. According to centuries-old Chinese tradition, a gravesite had to be prepared by a feng shui master in order to obtain good fortune for the dead as well as for the family members who survived. My grandmother hired a master from Shantou who came with his assistants. They lived in our house for almost 3 months in order to choose a place for the gravesite and supervise the building of the tomb. Finally, in August 1948, my first uncle, his second wife and their 2 sons flew in from Vietnam to join my grandmother and other family members in China to bury my grandfather, almost 9 years after he had died. Ironically, that gravesite that my grandmother had spent so much money and time to choose and build was taken over later by the Chinese Communist government for another use, and so we had to move my grandfather's tomb to another place. Later, this second place was also taken by the Chinese government. Finally, he was settled down on a hillside tomb near Shantou. My first uncle's family returned to Vietnam afterward, but he asked my grandmother and other family members to stay on in China, because by late spring of 1948, the war between the Viet Minh and the French had intensified throughout Vietnam. Artillery shelling was common in the countryside. The Viet Minh even sabotaged and sank a French Navy ship at the port of Can Tho. China was safer at the time, although there was also a civil war between the communists of Mao Zedong and the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek. It had been going on for several years already, but it was more concentrated in the north and northeast. The nationalist capital of Nanjing was still solidly controlled by the government of Chiang, and Shantou was far to the south. One day in early spring of 1949, my first uncle didn't show up at A.B. David's office at the Changno Street near the Old Market in Saigon as he had every weekday since the export market had rebounded after the war. He usually arrived with his chauffeur around 10 a.m. to gather the latest news and quotations of the rice market. If he could not make it, he would call to let his friend Sixth Master know. That day, it was already 11 a.m. and he was nowhere to be seen, nor was there a phone call. Sixth Master was puzzled but waited until 11:30 a.m. when there was still no sign of his friend. He called my first uncle's home. My aunt answered the phone and told him that he had left their house at Hong Bang Boulevard around 9:30 a.m. and should have arrived long ago. Alarmed, they started to worry. Sixth Master discussed the situation with Monsieur David, who by then had become good friends with my first uncle. Finally in the afternoon, with still no sign of my first uncle, his chauffeur or his car, Monsieur David notified the police and the French authorities. Since my first uncle was a well-known person in the business community, especially to the French, a search was launched in the whole of Saigon. The next morning, when the police found the car near the Botanical Garden of Saigon with no sign of my first uncle or his chauffeur, they knew it was a kidnapping. 2 days later, a woman sitting in the back seat of a car passing by my first uncle's office on Le Quang Lim Street, dropped a letter and quickly departed. The letter was from my first uncle. We finally knew that he had been kidnapped by the Viet Minh. He was so well known that he had caught their attention. He asked my aunt to cooperate with the kidnappers. My aunt dared not inform the police about the letter lest it would create more trouble for us. Instead she called Sixth Master to discuss the situation. Since the letter didn't mention what the kidnappers wanted, Sixth Master knew that they would try to contact us again. Every day he would wait inside my first uncle's car parked near our office. Meanwhile the chauffeur had been released by the kidnappers, but we couldn't get any more information concerning my first uncle's whereabouts. The police questioned him but he knew only that he had been held alone in a house, then taken for a ride by the kidnappers before dawn that day and dropped him off somewhere on a highway. He then took a bus to come home. My aunt didn't mention the letter to the chauffeur since she didn't want the police to know about that. 3 days later a car drove by and a woman dropped a letter again at our office. Sixth Master started the engine and chased the other car, finally succeeding in blocking it at a deserted corner. He got out of his car and went over to the other car and found 2 middle-aged women, one Vietnamese, one Chinese, sitting in the back seat. "Please ladies, can we talk?" Sixth Master asked. "Talk about what?" the Chinese woman answered in fluent Vietnamese. "Come on, you just dropped a letter at the office. I know that you kidnapped my friend Mr. Lam Nhu," Sixth Master said quietly. "No, we didn't kidnap anybody," the Chinese woman denied. "Please, as you can see, I am alone. If I really wanted to hurt you, I would have waited for you with the police. We just want to settle the matter, you know," Sixth Master explained calmly. The women looked around seeing that he was telling the truth. "Okay, we will talk, but not now, the day after tomorrow around 10 a.m., at Mr. Lam Nhu's house. We know where it is." Then they left. During the whole conversation, the other woman didn't utter a word. It seemed that the Chinese woman was their representative. Some passers-by looked on, but Sixth Master didn't want to draw attention so he also left quickly. Back home, Sixth Master related the encounter to my aunt. Feeling the pressure mounting heavier and heavier each day since the kidnapping, she felt that she would have difficulty dealing with it by herself. She asked Sixth Master and his wife and daughter to come live in my first uncle's house to be closer to help handle the case. The morning of the meeting day, my aunt and Sixth Master were waiting for them impatiently, eager to know what their conditions were. A little over 10 a.m., the 2 women arrived with 2 bodyguards, looking around cautiously before entering the house. They sat down on a sofa in the living room with the 2 men standing nearby. My aunt offered them some tea, they thanked her but didn't touch it. Sixth Master opened the talk. "Why did you kidnap Mr. Lam Nhu? What did he do wrong? He has too much money, he is too rich," the Chinese woman said. "That is it? That's it. So what do you want? What are your conditions to release him?" My aunt asked. We demand 3 million piastres, the other woman spoke for the first time. 3 million? Where do you want me to find the money? That is a big sum of money. My aunt was shocked by the ransom. Even it is big, you can find it, can't you? The other woman said. My aunt was astonished. 3 million piastres was a huge amount in 1949. We have to go now, the other woman went on. Whenever you are ready, put an ad in the newspaper saying that you have lost a black and white cat and will give a reward to whoever find it. We will come. They gave her the name of a local newspaper. We are in no rush, we will give you time to gather the money, the other women continued. Your husband is safe with us. We won't hurt him, we just want the money. Then all four of them left. Meanwhile, the whole family in China was being kept in the dark because my aunt dared not inform them, especially my grandmother. 3 weeks after the kidnapping, my grandmothers-in-law dropped by to visit her and asked whether my first uncle had been released. Surprised by the question, my grandmother asked, "Released from what? What? You don't know that Nhu has been kidnapped by the Viet Minh?" The news knocked her senseless like a hammer blow. When she came to, my grandmother wanted to go back to Vietnam to handle the matter, but my father didn't want her to go. Instead he volunteered himself, as he was the second son in the family. My mother had given birth about 10 days before to my elder brother, Dan, her first child, and they were still in the hospital, so my father flew back to Vietnam alone to help his sister-in-law. On arrival at my first uncle's house, my father was relieved to see Sixth Master there, because he was a good friend of the family whom we trusted. Ever since my first uncle had been held by the kidnappers, nobody could withdraw money from his bank account because they needed his signature. My aunt emptied her personal savings account and gathered only 500,000 piastres. They had no choice but to contact the kidnappers and let them know. Sixth Master put an advertisement in the designated newspaper. 3 days later, the two women and their bodyguards came over at the same time. Sixth Master asked my father to stay inside and not to come out to the living room because he was afraid my father's hot temper might worsen the whole matter. The ladies were seated and the two men stood nearby just like the last time. We have gathered only 500,000 piastres. We cannot get more, Sixth Master said and showed them the hemp rice sack where he had put the money. It's 3 million we demanded, not 500,000, the Chinese woman said after glancing inside the bag. But you hold Mr. Lam Nhu hostage. Even if he has money in the bank, we cannot get it without his signature, Sixth Master protested. Then get money from somewhere else, said the other woman. Where do you want us to get the money? I have already emptied all my saving and that is all I have, my aunt answered. Well, you have your house, the other woman gestured, and we also know that you have houses and lands in the country. Go sell them and get the money. They are under the name of my husband or my mother-in-law. I cannot sell them without their signature. Do whatever you need to do to get the money. We will give you more time and come back later. They picked up the rice sack with the 500,000 piastres and left. My aunt didn't know what to do next. Every day she prayed for heaven's help. Then 3 weeks later, out of the blue, she received a phone call from my first uncle. He had just escaped from his kidnappers. According to what he had told us later, on the morning when he was kidnapped, the chauffeur was driving him to A.B. David's office as usual. He was seated in the back seat on the passenger side. When they stopped at a traffic light on a quite deserted road, two men suddenly jumped out from a nearby vehicle and approached his car. One opened the door on his side and pushed him inward with a gun pointed to him, the other one slipped in from the other side. They gave the chauffeur directions and ordered him to drive carefully without drawing attention of the passers-by. When they were near the Saigon Botanical Garden, they told the chauffeur to stop the car at a quiet corner. They ordered both of them to get out of the car and get into another car parked there. They put a rice sack over my first uncle's head and pushed his head down, then they gave one to the chauffeur and told him to do the same and sit on the front floor so that people outside could not see him. They rode in the car for about an hour. At some point my first uncle sensed that the car seemed to be crossing some rail tracks, that was all he knew. They then stopped the car, ordered him to get out and get aboard a boat. The boat sailed for 2 or 3 hours, then it docked and he was led into a house, at which point they took the sack from his head. During the whole journey, he had kept his silence. It was a simple wooden house with a thatched roof in the midst of some rice fields. There were 2 bedrooms and a living room and a kitchen that also served as the dining room. The front yard was surrounded by a bamboo fence with a bathroom at the side. The back of the house led to the small river, his route to this place. He asked his kidnappers who they were, they told him. Then he asked what they wanted, they told him, too. Then he asked where he was, they didn't want to tell him. They asked him to write a letter to his wife telling her to cooperate with them. That was the only communication he had with the family. He was very well treated during his captivity. They even fed him well. Since he always carried some money on him, he gave them the money to buy and prepare some food that he liked to eat. They gave him a pair of slippers and some peasant clothes because he had only the shirt and pants that he was wearing on the first day. They allowed him to go in the yard but not outside the fence. At all times there was always at least one guard to keep an eye on him. There were a half-dozen other households not far away. It seemed that the whole village was under their control. Every day he spent his time in his room, reading some books handed to him by the guards for his pastime. He also paced back and forth in the front yard, doing some exercises to stretch his legs and arms. There was nothing else he could do here. At night he went to bed early even if he was not feeling sleepy because there was no electricity in the village. He would often lie awake half the night and think of how to escape, but how could he escape when he didn't even know where he was? During the day, he saw that the small, narrow, mud road about 100 feet from the house led to another road a little bit farther away. Sometimes he saw bicycles passing by on that bigger road, but he had no idea where the road led. Hardly a day went by without his thinking of returning to his familiar Saigon. One day he felt that the guards had been treating him more kindly during the past several days. They seemed more relaxed with him and chatted with him from time to time. One of the young guards in his early 20s even asked him questions about the rice industry and seemed eager to learn the trade. He found out later that it was the time my aunt had made a partial payment of 500,000 piastres. When the young guard was on duty alone, not wanting to show his real intention, my first uncle chatted with him casually about the rice-producing areas of Mekong Delta. Then he pointed out the rice field in front and mentioned that this place seemed to have fertile soil for growing rice. The guard told him that they were in the Dong Thap province, not far from the Cambodian border. My first uncle knew that Dong Thap was located at about 100 miles southwest of Saigon with numerous interlaced river canals. It shared a 30-mile border with Cambodia to its north, but how close was he to the border? He dared not ask further lest the guard would suspect what he had in his mind. He also knew that if he could pass over the border, he would be safer because the Viet Minh didn't have control on the other side. He noticed that the bigger road in the distance seemed to lie in a north-south direction. If he wanted to escape, he would have to turn left to the north. Since he had been kidnapped for quite a long time now and the guards seemed looser about security, he couldn't take his mind off escaping. After lunch 3 days later, dark clouds began gathering in the distance. Before long the fourth rain of the season started to pour down on the thatched roof, sounding like a lullaby. He looked outside. There was nobody in the field and the road in the distance was empty. He took a look at the guard who was having a nap in his hammock slung at the back of the front door. His heart began to race. He had to take his chance now or never, for the rain could be a good cover for him. Hopefully, his kidnappers would be reluctant to pursue him in the heavy rain. He walked quietly out the house into the torrential rain as if he was going to the toilet. On his way out he saw a Vietnamese conical hat. He picked it up and put on his head. It would help protect him from the rain, but especially it would help conceal his face so that nobody would know who he was from a distance. He kept walking, went through the fence gate and continued steadily without showing any sign of escaping. He reached the narrow dirt road, with puddles everywhere. He passed a distant house, feeling relieved that no one was out watching him. He was grateful that the rain would wash out his footsteps. Approaching the bigger road, looking back and seeing that there was still no sign of alarm from the detention house, he quickened his steps. Reaching the dirt road, he turned left toward the north and walked past several houses here and there without drawing any attention. Some children were playing in the rain in a front yard, but they ignored him. There were only a few people on the road, but they all walked hastily with their heads bent low to protect themselves from the rain, without even paying him a glance. He was now all wet from his waist down because of the big rains, but he kept going. He increased his speed as a traveler who was eager to arrive home under this torrential rain. After a while he noticed that the road had narrowed and on both sides there were woods and no more houses. The road was deserted and the sky became darker as the rains stopped. He decided to get into the woods, but walked following the road. If his pursuers came searching for him, they would not see anyone on the road. Glancing around quickly and seeing nobody watching, he swiftly slipped into the woods. He was almost running now because nobody could see him. Under cover of darkness and the woods, he kept running and running without noticing that he was getting blisters on his right foot or that the rains were pouring down again. The tree canopy protected him somewhat from the raindrops and the noisy swinging of their leaves under the rising winds concealed the sound of the rain. Suddenly he was out of the woods and at the end of the road. Before him was a stream about 60 feet wide. On the other side, there were more woods and seemingly no road at all. What should he do? There was no way he could go back. His only choice was to cross the stream before him and go into the woods again. He went slowly down to the stream to test the water. Its coolness made his blisters feel better. He bent down, scooped up handfuls of water and drank greedily, slacking his thirst after the long run. It seemed the current was not very strong, so he walked slowly out until it was deep enough to swim, then he touched bottom again on the other side and walked up the bank. Once he got into the woods, he stopped and looked back across the stream, feeling relieved that there were still no signs of his captors searching for him. He didn't know where he was, but at least he thought he was going in the right direction. He saw a trail that led to somewhere deeper into the woods. With no other choice, he followed the seemingly unused trail until complete darkness had fallen. He knew that he had run a good distance and felt that he could stop safely for the night, plus it was too dark to continue. He chose an empty spot under a big tree a bit off the trail and sat down. He was hungry, exhausted, and had no food, but at least the rain had stopped. He was stung by mosquitoes, but was too tired to notice, and didn't even feel cold from his wet shirt and pants. Exhausted, he quickly fell asleep. The crowing of cocks in the distance awakened him near dawn. Where there are cocks, there are human beings. There must be a village not far from here, he thought. But did it belong to friend or foe? He got up and walked cautiously along the trail as the sky started to brighten. Approaching the edge of the woods, he slowed his pace, as he didn't know what was awaiting him outside. He peered from behind a tree. Before him was a field with tall grass and beyond that there was a big fenced compound with a large yard. Smoke was rising from a chimney and several people were standing near the gate. A flag flew from the flagpole, but it was too far for him to see whose flag it was. He came slowly out of the woods, bent low and walked cautiously along a trail across the field, trying not to draw the attention of the people near the gate. He went closer to see what the place was before deciding whether he should go to seek help. Finally he was close enough to recognize the French flag on the post. He didn't know yet what the place was, but at least it belonged to the French authorities. He was so glad to see that flag that he was almost jumping out from his concealment. Approaching the gate, he saw one of the men shouldering a rifle. He could see that they all had darker skin than the normal Vietnamese, and suddenly it flashed into his mind that they were Cambodian. He was in Cambodian soil. He quickly took off his conical hat and raised his hands, one still holding the hat, to show that he was not armed. He feared that the man might mistake him for the enemy and shoot him, because the French were at war with the Viet Minh. The men seemed totally surprised to see him coming out from nowhere, especially when they recognized the Vietnamese conical hat. My first uncle asked them in French what the place was, and they told him it was a French outpost in Cambodia. He then requested to see the commandant of the outpost. The commandant, a French gentleman, came out with several of his French and Cambodian aides who were also surprised to see my first uncle there. But they were more astonished when the commandant invited my first uncle into his office and listened to him recount his story. At first, the commandant refused to believe it, the story seemed too incredible. But since my first uncle had a good command of French, meaning he was an educated person, besides looking more like a businessman than a peasant in spite of his clothes, the commandant started to believe him. To further convince him, my first uncle asked him to call the French authorities in Saigon to verify his identity as well as his kidnapping, which the commandant did. After verification, the authorities in Saigon even asked him to protect my first uncle and to give him a pistol for self-defense. Later the commandant had his men escort my first uncle to Phnom Penh. After his escape, my first uncle dared not return to Saigon because he knew that the Viet Minh would try to recapture him. Besides, he already had some business ties in Cambodia. The country was a peaceful place with no war at that time, and the rice business was also flourishing in this Mekong Delta country. In Vietnam, the Viet Minh had intensified their fighting with the French, so he decided to stay on and move a big chunk of his business operation from Saigon to Phnom Penh, where about a dozen employees followed. He recruited one of his cousins, Uncle Ba Sang, one of the 16 children of my grandmother's elder brother and the same age as my uncle, who was working at the Banque de l'Indochine, Bank of Indochina, at the time. He later became one of my first uncle's right-hand men. At a place that the Chinese in Phnom Penh called 3.5 kilometers, he started building a bigger rice mill than the one we had at our house at Kai Rang. It would produce rice for the local market as well as for export. He also bought a 3-story building in the city to serve as office and lodgings for some employees. Although he discreetly made several trips back to Vietnam now and then, most of the time he stayed in Phnom Penh and built up the business there and didn't actually return until the end of 1954. From time to time my aunt would take their children to visit him in Phnom Penh, and my father would go work with him and report on the operation at Kai Rang. One of the reasons my first uncle stayed a little longer in Phnom Penh was an incident that happened about 1 year after his escape, which convinced him that the Viet Minh were still looking for him. One day, one of his employees that we called Uncle Son was sent for a business trip to Bac Lu, a city about 70 miles south of Can Tho. He was stopped and arrested by the Viet Minh on one of the deserted sections of the highway which connected Can Tho and Bac Lu. Because he bore a strong resemblance to my first uncle, in his looks as well as his body shape, they interrogated him. He was terrified and told them that he was just an employee of my first uncle. After verification, they finally released him, but he dared not return to that area anymore and went to join my first uncle in Phnom Penh. By 1953, the war between the French and the Viet Minh had drawn to its end after the fierce fighting had spread to the whole country. During the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in the spring of 1954, where the French were defeated by the Viet Minh, my first uncle moved to Hong Kong for several months for fear that the Vietnamese communists would take control of the whole of Indochina. Back in China, 1949 marked the year the Chinese communists took over the country. The situation had deteriorated since my first uncle had left China a couple of months before. By January, the Communists had captured Tianjin, an important northern city, then Beijing, another crucial stronghold in the north. By then, scenes of panic started showing up in Nanjing and Shanghai. The nationalist loyalists tried desperately to move further to the south or simply to leave the country. By May, the People's Liberation Army had taken over Nanjing and Shanghai. The trend was then irreversible, although the remains of the nationalist army tried to resist. In October, Mao declared the birth of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, the new capital of the country. Finally in December, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan. My sixth uncle still remembers seeing thousands of fleeing army soldiers boarding ships at the port of Shantou. This marked the beginning of a new era. My grandmother, my mother and my elder brother, as well as several of my aunts and uncles were stuck in China. Soon the new government started its land reform and arrested people who were considered capitalist or counter-revolutionary, landlords, businessmen, etc., and confiscated their possessions. At the time most of the family members lived in our house at Shantou, which had been purchased about 2 years before. The land reform didn't affect Shantou until late in 1951. By then, my third uncle, as well as my third and fifth aunt, had already slipped away. Because my third uncle was the person in charge of our rice business at Shantou, he knew that if he stayed there, the government would arrest him. Before leaving home, my grandmother gave him some money and a pair of big diamond earrings for his travel expenses. He went first to Hong Kong but saw that the place was dull and seemed to have no future. He then returned to China and went to Guangzhou. With the help of a former teacher whom he knew in Vietnam, he entered a vocational school and studied accounting. My third aunt also went to study accounting in a nearby city to avoid any trouble at home, whereas my fifth aunt headed further north to attend university in Beijing. Other aunts and uncles were still too young to leave, so they stayed home. My sixth and seventh uncle attended the Shantou Overseas Chinese Middle School. When the land reform began, there was a so-called Liberation Army contact station at Shantou. Whenever the Farmers' Committee, the equivalent of the People's Committee in rural areas because it was composed mainly of farmers, wanted to arrest someone, they would come to the station to make a request and the station would send a soldier to accompany them and make the arrest. They first arrested my mainland grandmother and my little uncle who were living at our house in the floating grass village and held them in custody at our shrine just a few steps away. They wanted my mainland grandmother's money and gold, but since she didn't have any, they turned to my grandmother. One night they came to our house at Shantou and arrested my grandmother. They held her at the station for the night and then sent her to our shrine the next day to be together with my mainland grandmother. No family member was allowed to visit them. They questioned my grandmother day and night about where she had hidden her gold and money, which she was to declare and hand over to the government before she would be released. My grandmother told them that she had not hidden any gold, that we were overseas Chinese, we didn't make our money in China, we lived and did business in Vietnam, we only sent money back home to buy houses and lands, and we didn't exploit anyone in China. They then told her that she should pay overdue taxes because she had lands and houses in China, and that she had to ask her children to send money back to have her released. The amount of taxes changed every 2 or 3 weeks depending upon who was questioning her. In fact, my first uncle had a sum of money then equivalent to several tens of thousands of Hong Kong dollars, which had been frozen in an account in the Bank of China because it had been deposited just before the changeover of the government. Much later the new Bank of China informed my third uncle to come withdraw this money, which, when converted to the new government's currency, was now almost worthless. At the beginning of her captivity, my grandmother had to stay inside the shrine and was not even allowed to go out to the front yard. After a couple of weeks, she asked the committee to allow her to go out and sweep the front yard from time to time, because she needed some exercise and felt sick sitting inside all day long. They accepted her request. At night, she slept on the grass-covered floor because there was no bed in the shrine, not even a blanket to help withstand the cold winds of winter. Also, with the food ration the Farmers' Committee allocated her, she didn't have enough to eat. At that time, the wife of one of my grandfather's elder brothers lived next door to the shrine. Their house had been built with the money my grandfather had sent back home. Once or twice a week, she would secretly supply food to my grandmother. With a pre-arranged signal, she would pretend to call to her daughter to give her a bowl or something. My grandmother would know that her sister-in-law had food for her and would go out and pretend to sweep the shrine's front yard. Her sister-in-law would throw something into the yard for her to catch. Sometimes it was a pastry, another time it would be sour vegetables wrapped in some sort of leaf which she could eat with rice porridge. Later, when there was not even enough rice porridge, my grandmother would have to go begging to some neighbors whom she used to help. They would happily pour her a bowl or sometimes even a pot of porridge because they had received favors from her in the past. By this time, the committee was less strict with her because they had begun to receive money from my first uncle. On several occasions, my mother had to go and sell her gold jewelry to help make the payment to the government. Selling gold at the time was a quite time-consuming matter, because after the takeover by the communists, the only place to sell gold was through a bank. The farmers' committee had people declare how much gold they had, then they told them to sell it at the bank and give the money to the committee. Since there were so many people who had to sell gold to make payments to the government, one had to line up outside a bank during the night and wait for opening time the next morning. Since my elder brother was still very young, my mother could not queue up during the night. Each time she would ask an old lady who lived next door to our house at Shantou to stand in line for her, then the next morning she would go to the bank, take the old lady's place and sell the gold. My first uncle had made several payments to the committee via my mother because that was where they came to collect the money. Seeing that the authorities still had no intention of releasing my grandmother and wanted more money, my mother told the commune cadres that my first uncle would not pay any more unless my grandmother signed a letter asking for more money. In fact, it was a pretext to get my grandmother out to Shantou temporarily. Because my grandmother was illiterate, she could not sign her name. But they did believe that and take her to our house at Shantou 1 week later to sign the letter. When my grandmother arrived home with the guards, my mother was at work at the Shantou overseas Chinese factory where she made hemp bags. My first uncle's first wife was at home and ran to the factory to inform my mother, whereupon they rushed home. Upon seeing my mother, my grandmother took her tightly in her arms, and tears welled down both faces with no words spoken. Seeing that her request to allow the visit of her mother-in-law had been accepted, my mother asked for more. She asked the commune cadres to allow my grandmother to stay for 1 week so that she could report her situation to my first uncle in order to facilitate the payment. Surprisingly, they accepted it too, maybe because they thought that their good gesture would allow them to extract more money from us. After they left, my mother went out to buy my grandmother a bowl of noodle soup with meatballs made of ground fish. My grandmother was so hungry that she finished it in 2 or 3 gulps and asked for more. When my elder brother came home from kindergarten that afternoon, he was so scared at seeing my grandmother, who was thin as a ghost and dressed in ragged clothes, that he ran crying toward my mother. My mother comforted him and told him it was his grandma. During that week, my grandmother was so hungry she ate everything my mother prepared for her. After 1 week, the commune cadres came and took my grandmother back to the shrine. Finally, after my first uncle made several more payments to the commune and because by that time, the Chinese government needed the support of the overseas Chinese to solidify their position in the international political stage, my grandmother was released after more than 1 year of detention. But she could not leave China yet, she had to stay on because the government didn't know yet what to do with overseas Chinese. Later the government expropriated our houses and lands as well as the shrine. During the whole period while the family was in China, my first uncle had to send money back to provide for their living. My fifth uncle was also arrested by the government, but for another reason. One day during the early 1930s, when our family was better off, my great-grandmother was kidnapped by some mountain bandits. At that time, rural China was well known for this kind of bandits. They were just poor villagers who lived in the mountainous area and tried to profit from wealthy people, especially overseas Chinese. When the family paid the ransom, they released my great-grandmother. After that, my grandfather had a lookout built and hired watchmen during the night to stand guard over all our houses. These houses had been built next to each other with corridors between them. The villagers knew that we had 5 rifles at home. Every night there were at least 2 or 3 people on duty at the lookout. After my parents were married and during the time that my father was in China, he always slept with a rifle in his room. When the new government took over the country, they found out from the villagers about the rifles and came to confiscate them. Somehow, my fifth uncle threw one of the rifles into a well. We never knew why he did it, out of frustration maybe, but because of this, he was arrested by the government even though they retrieved the rifle. He was so starved during his captivity that when my mainland grandmother went to visit him, he told her that he was dreaming of eating a bowl of rice with Chinese broccoli. When she prepared it and took it to the prison for him, he ate 2 gulps and died. He was only 21 years old. Around the beginning of 1954, seeing that the country had stabilized and government policy was more favorable toward overseas Chinese, my mother started applying to get out of the country to join my father. She told the commune cadres that she was married to an overseas Chinese in Vietnam, she had to follow her husband, and besides, nobody in China could provide for her and her child's needs. Finally in 1955, she and my elder brother were allowed to leave China for Vietnam. My father was in Phnom Penh taking care of my first uncle's business there, and my mother joined him after a short stay in Vietnam. After my mother arrived in Phnom Penh, the family started applying for my grandmother to leave China, too. By now, my mother understood how the bureaucracy in communist China worked, and asked the bookkeeper of our company who had a handsome handwriting to write to the Overseas Chinese Affairs Committee in Beijing. The bookkeeper also wrote to the committee's counterpart in Shantou asking for my grandmother to leave the country, under the pretext that we needed her to sign deeds in order to sell lands and houses in Vietnam. 1 year later, my grandmother was able to leave. Then it was the turn of my 7th uncle, in 1957, who joined my parents later in Phnom Penh. 6th uncle left in 1958 and finally my 3rd uncle slipped out to Hong Kong in 1963. My maternal grandparents were less fortunate. My maternal grandfather did not want to stay in Vietnam after the death of his overseas wife, so he took all his money with him and bought lands, rice fields and houses in China. He even opened a small bank at Shantou with several of his Chaoyang friends as partners. During that period until the Chinese Communists took over the country, whenever his friends from Chaoyang, including my grandfather, went back to visit China, they would go to his house upon arrival at Shantou, which was the central landing and boarding port for merchant ships for the whole region. His visitors would stay there for a couple of days, go to theaters and restaurants and then travel on to their hometowns, which might take 2 days of traveling. For their trip back to Vietnam, they did the same, they would come out from their home villages and stay at his house a few days while waiting to board the ship. My maternal grandfather rented his rice fields to other farmers and they paid rents with their crops. When they had a bumper harvest and paid their full quota, he would have paddy rice in all his storerooms in the house. During the sunny days, his children would spread the paddy rice in the courtyard to dry. But when the yield was bad, the farmers could not meet the full quota. Then my mother and all her sisters and brothers would go out into the fields which were spread all over the countryside, watch the farmers cut their crops and split the harvest with them right on the spot. She always remembered one day during the winter when the weather was so cold that she ran back home, pour 2 cups of liquor from her father's liquor jar and drink them to help to keep her warm. After drinking the liquor, she ran into her mother who asked why she was home and not in the field. My mother told her that it was too cold, she had gone home to warm up. But she dared not tell her that she had drunk 2 cups of her father's liquor. She was only 11 or 12 at the time. My mother was a good-hearted person, she always let the farmers keep the bigger part of the harvest when they could not meet their quota. This had saved her a lot of troubles when the communists took over the country later, because many members of the Farmers' Committee still remembered her kindness. In 1951, my maternal grandparents were arrested by the Farmers' Committee and kept in custody as were many other landlords in China. They both died during their captivity because of chronic starvation and the hardships of imprisonment. Meanwhile in Vietnam, by the end of 1954, the French had retreated and the country was divided into 2. The north was occupied by the communists and the south controlled by the capitalists. My first uncle decided to move back to Saigon to rebuild his business there and asked my father, who would be joined later by my mother and 7th uncle, to attend to the business in Phnom Penh. Around the beginning of 1955, now that the French had withdrawn from Indochina, A.B. David decided to liquidate his business and leave Vietnam. Needless to say, Sixth Master, who by then had become one of my first uncle's right-hand men, advising him in many of his business decisions, would have to find another job. My first uncle saw the opportunity and invited Sixth Master to join forces with him and Uncle Ba Sang, who had worked with him in Phnom Penh from 1950 to 1955. The three created the Hao Jiang Company, poised for the next great leap forward. The Republic of Vietnam was created in October of that year with Ngo Dinh Diem as president. In the beginning, the company just continued in the rice business. Sixth Master took care of sales and Uncle Ba Sang dealt with administration, accounting and government affairs. After a while they started importing wheat flour from France and Australia. By 1956, most small rice mills in the region of Can Tho were concentrated in Cai Rang, and my first uncle decided to build a bigger mill in town. He bought a piece of land across the river just outside the town, near the Cai Rang Bridge. Then he had the rice mill in Phnom Penh dismantled and sent our barges there to bring it to its new home at Cai Rang. He did the same with the smaller rice mill located in our house. By the end of the year, the new Hao Jiang rice mill with 2 machines that could husk 100 tons of rice in 24 hours, was up and running. I was born that year in Phnom Penh. Shortly after they began importing and distributing wheat flour, which involved about 40 companies in South Vietnam, the market started heating up because of a short supply of flour. There were not adequate storage facilities to maintain large inventories of wheat flour in good condition under the tropical climatic conditions. Shortages occurred especially from August to February, when people needed flour to make pastry for religious offerings on important holidays or simply for household consumption. Almost every company was selling at black market prices except Hao Jiang and a few others. Because of their integrity, my first uncle, Sixth Master and Uncle Ba Sang refused to follow the crowds and maintained a reasonable price with an acceptable margin. In order to control the price for the consumers, the Ministry of Economy sent out an army of inspectors to catch and fine the black marketeers, but the problem persisted because of many corrupt officials in the ministry. Soon, by word of mouth, all the bakeries came to buy from Hao Jiang, as long as they had stock. Once, a lady who was the owner of a bakery in Long Hai came to buy 2 tons of flour. After paying Sixth Master the asking price, she gave him an additional 5,000 piastres. "What is that for?" the puzzled Sixth Master asked the lady. "To thank you, because if I buy that in the black market, I would have to pay 10,000 more. I give you half and I still make a profit of half." Sixth Master burst out laughing and returned the money to her. Soon, even Hao Jiang had difficulty obtaining a supply, because the market was being taken over by the black marketeers. One day, they received a phone call from the Vice President of Vietnam, Mr. Nguyen Ngoc Tho, who also held the position of Minister of Economy at the time. He wanted to see the owners of Hao Jiang Company. My first uncle was a little worried as he didn't know what the reason was. They were not involved in any political activity nor were they doing anything wrong. Why did the vice president want to see them? The next morning, my first uncle, Sixth Master and Uncle Ba Sang were received by the vice president in his office. He told them that he was aware of the black market problem in the supplying of wheat flour, and after investigation by his ministry, he also knew that Hao Jiang was doing a very good job in trying to stabilize the market and not to profit from it unscrupulously. He praised them for their professionalism, then he proposed a deal. In order to stabilize the price and ensure a stable supply to the flour market, he was thinking of cancelling all the import licenses of the other importers and asking Hao Jiang to be the sole importer and distributor of wheat flour in the whole South Vietnam. That was a tall order. My first uncle and his 2 associates dared not give a clear-cut response on the spot, instead they requested some time for reflection. They returned to their office and discussed the vice president's proposal in great lengths. If they refused the proposal, the vice president would find another company to do it and they would lock themselves out. Worse than that, they might get into trouble with the government later because one just couldn't refuse a request from the vice president. But if they accepted it, this would surely create a big turmoil within the wheat flour industry. Not only they would make enemies amongst their peers but also amongst the rank of corrupt officials in the Ministry of Economy. Other companies would be cut off from the trade, which also meant profit, and Chaoyang would become some sort of monopoly, albeit not by choice, and the corrupt officials would not be able to accept bribes from the black marketeers anymore. After a long discussion, they came to a conclusion and went to see the vice president to discuss it. First of all, they thanked the vice president for the honor to be chosen as the sole distributor, then they expounded their worries about the quasi-monopolistic situation they would create, and finally they proposed a plan. They would accept the vice president's proposal, but instead of doing it alone, they would recruit 4 other distributors, whom they knew for their integrity and honesty, to join them. They would set up a distribution committee under the supervision of Chaoyang. All purchase orders of big quantities of flour would have to be reviewed by the committee and must have the stamp of the minister as well as other provincial authorities, for they didn't want to be blamed later for any problem for the unstable supply of the market. The vice president liked their plan and approved it. Shortly after, the licenses of other importers were withdrawn and official prices for flour were published. Any bakery or pastry shop that wanted to buy flour must have a certificate issued by the government with an allocated quota. A larger quantity had to be approved by the Minister of Economy. Before long, prices stabilized and the black market disappeared. But there was always someone who tried to cheat. One morning, a woman from Guangdong, a small province from the south, came to buy 200 tons of flour. She handed Sixth Master a certificate with several stamps on it. Sixth Master asked what she wanted to do with that much flour and she told him she was the owner of a pastry shop at Guangdong specializing in bon bao, a kind of Chinese pie stuffed with meat. Sixth Master knew that bon bao was made with only a little flour and wondered why she needed that much, but he could not refuse to sell as she had the certificate. He asked her to come back in 2 hours since he had to consult the committee. Sixth Master called in the committee, who usually met every weekday morning around 10 a.m. When they examined the request, Sixth Master noticed that the stamp from the Ministry of Economy was of a different kind. When the woman came back, he told her that the stamp was missing from the minister's certificate and asked her to go get it while he prepared her order. She never came back. Surprisingly, the vice president didn't set up the plan to profit himself. As everyone knew, the Vietnamese government was very corrupt, many officials taking bribes, but in this case, the vice president didn't ask Chaoyang to pay anything back to him. My first uncle, Sixth Master, and Uncle Ba Sang were also incorruptible. During all their life, they would do things the straightforward way, even though this had created some enemies within the ministry with which they dealt. About 1 year after setting up the Flour Distribution Committee and seeing that Chaoyang was doing a very good job in stabilizing the flour market, the vice president suggested that they do the same with charcoal, which was one of the main sources of energy for household cooking in Vietnam. At that time, the production of charcoal was very scattered, there were many small shops, the quality was uneven and the price was very unstable due to the shortage from time to time. The vice president proposed that they establish a production and distribution system to supply the market. Charcoal was made by charring wood in a kiln to exclude air. One of the areas in South Vietnam which was famous in producing charcoal was Ca Mau, a province about 100 miles southwest of Can Tho. Its U Minh submerged forest produced a kind of tree known locally as K Duoc, which was used to produce a very good quality charred wood. My first uncle and Sixth Master went to Ca Mau to explore the region. They joined forces with a French company at Can Tho, the Western Forestry Development, which was run by 2 brothers, Paul and Antonin Emery, with 130 barges at their disposal. They gathered the charcoal producers in the area and organized them into a network of suppliers. They then set up a distribution system to supply the major centers who in turn supplied the local distributors. About 1 year after the charcoal distribution had been up and running smoothly, a rumor circulated in Saigon that a new group for charcoal distribution was being formed to rival Chaoyang. The group was led by some officials from the Ministry of Labor with the backing of its minister and especially of Madame Ngo Dinh Nhu. That was terrifying news, for nobody would dare to compete with Madame Nhu, dubbed the most powerful woman in South Vietnam. Her husband, Ngo Dinh Nhu, was the head of the secret police and the brother of the president of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem. My first uncle and his 2 associates started worrying. They went to see the vice president and told him that if the group led by Madame Nhu wanted to take over the distribution of charcoal, then Chaoyang would withdraw and leave it to the new group. The vice president told them not to worry and let him find a solution. Shortly after, the vice president suggested that they call a meeting with all the charcoal producers at Ca Mau, and hold a secret vote to decide to whom they wanted to sell their output. My first uncle, 6th Master and Uncle Ba Sang were a bit hesitant, for they didn't want to get involved in any political maneuver, they were just honest businessmen with no political interests. Finally, following the advice of the vice president, they decided to hold a vote. Out of the almost 200 votes, Chaoyang won all but 3 votes. The producers preferred to trust and sell to the group with whom they had dealt for more than a year, and with whom they had a very good business relationship, rather than to deal with a new group. Soon afterward, the new group withdrew their plan. Chaoyang never knew whether any additional maneuvers were performed behind the scenes, or what exactly was the reason for the new group to abandon their plan, but they were happy that the whole matter settled without incident. They didn't want to get involved in politics anyway. By 1958, Chaoyang had control of almost the whole distribution market for rice, flour and charcoal in South Vietnam. The Flour Distribution Committee was dissolved later when the supply became more abundant. It was also around this time that my first uncle joined forces with one of his friends, Trong Phung, and 2 other people, Chung Kai Tan and Xa Keen. They created a textile company called International Textile Company located at Linh Xuan Thon, Tu Duc district of Saigon. At its peak, the company had a total capital of 250 million piastres with about 300 automated looms and 400 workers running 3 shifts a day. He sent Uncle Ba Sang to work with the textile company and take care of business there, while he and 6th Master remained at Chaoyang. He also started to invest in real estate, and even became a part owner of the famous Caravel Hotel in Saigon. After dismantling the rice mill in Phnom Penh and taking it to Cai Rang, my father and 7th uncle continued with the rice business there for a while by renting other rice mills to process paddy rice. Then they started looking at other opportunities. They began exporting corn to Singapore and importing office supplies and electronic products from Hong Kong and Japan. The business was prospering. In my early memory, we had an easy life in Phnom Penh, the country was without war, and we lived in a 3-story house located at 221 Sisawat Street, facing the Bassac River. The ground floor was used for business activities, and the second was used as free lodgings which we provided for the families of some key employees such as the bookkeeper, the treasurer and other single employees, about a dozen people in all. On the 3rd floor lived our own family, including my 7th uncle and a cousin, my first uncle's son by his first wife. We used to go to what the local Chinese called Tai Ca Mau to have breakfast almost every other Sunday because of its famous Chinese soups and noodles as well as its playground for children. On some national holidays, we would watch fireworks from our flat roof. I still remember when I was about 4 years old, watching a fireworks display from the flat roof. I was so scared of the noise of the fireworks that if I needed to go downstairs and nobody wanted to accompany me, I would run fast down the stairs to reach each floor before the next explosion. The Dragon Boat Festival was a big event in Phnom Penh around the 1960s, occurring on the 5th day of the 5th month in the lunar calendar, around mid-June in the Western calendar. Dragon boats were so named because the bow of each boat was decorated in the shape of a dragon. The culmination of the festival was the boat race. Since it took place on the Bassac River, we could watch it from the 2nd or 3rd floor balcony of our house. At one end of each boat, there was a team of percussion instrument players equipped with drum, gong and cymbals. When the race started, the drummer on each boat would pound on the drum and the other players would strike the gong and cymbals in a fast rhythm to speed up the oarsmen. The spectators who crowded along the riverbanks would yell and shout louder and louder to encourage all the participating teams. The Parade of Deities was also a very big festival, occurring on the 15th day of the first lunar month of the Chinese calendar. It was a parade of people who somehow fell into a trance and became what we called deities. They would parade down Sisowath Street, where almost every house along its passage had set up a worship table to make offerings to the deities. Some deities walked, others were carried in open trucks or carts, some were sitting or lying down on a bed of nails or jumping on a platform filled with broken glass without feeling pain. Some had themselves beaten with an iron bar or chain, some would cut their own tongues with a sword and then lick a small piece of yellowish rectangular paper and give it to passers-by who requested it. The bloody paper would serve as a talisman that people used to hang at the front door of their house to ward off evil spirits and ensure good fortune. Or they would burn it and mix it with water to drink in order to chase away some mysterious illness, when traditional Western or Oriental medicine was of no help. One year when my grandmother and my first uncle's second wife came visit us, the parade took place during their stay in Phnom Penh. My grandmother was a very faithful Buddhist. When the parade passed before our house, all of a sudden a deity with a sword in hand jumped into our house and performed in front of our worship table. This was considered a very auspicious sign for the owner of the house. My grandmother was so shocked that she didn't stop kowtowing until the deity finished his performance and left. Before leaving, he handed my grandmother a blooded talisman without her even asking for. It was hard to believe, but that year was our most profitable year in Phnom Penh. My fifth brother, Hao, was born that year. My third and fourth brother, Zung and Thien, were also born in Phnom Penh. We all had a Maz to take care of us. As we went to a Chinese elementary school far from the house, every day my seventh uncle or the chauffeur would drive us there. When our father or seventh uncle were not busy, once a month or every 2 months, one of them would drive us to Phat, a famous seaside resort about 100 miles from Phnom Penh. What I enjoyed the most was swimming and eating the deep-fried birds sold by strolling vendors on the beach. One time my fourth brother was badly stung on his thigh by a jellyfish while playing in the water there, causing him to cry a lot. About 20 miles from Kep was Bokor Mountain, 3,000 feet above sea level. Its cool air made it an ideal place to escape the heat of Phnom Penh. It had been used by the French during colonial times as a vacation spot. On the mountain was a casino to which my seventh uncle took us several times. At the casino restaurant, my favorite was the Chinese-style fried oysters with eggs, which the Teo Chew people called o loa. Meanwhile in Vietnam, around 1963, a journalist named Dan Phong, who was reportedly encouraged by some disgruntled officials in the Ministry of Economy, published several newspaper articles criticizing the Hao Jiang Company. He said that Hao Jiang was selling charcoal at black market prices, and that Hao Jiang was cheating the government on taxes during those years of charcoal distribution. He charged that our real costs of transport were much less than what we had declared, and therefore by his estimate, Hao Jiang owed the government 2 million piastres in arrears for taxes. Worse than that, he seemed aware of the fact that my first uncle had been kidnapped by the Viet Minh, and hinted that my first uncle was supporting the Vietnamese communists. The government started investigating. The accusation caught my first uncle off guard and he became worried. The charges of cheating the government on taxes or of being a black marketeer were a problem, but the charge of supporting the Viet Minh was much more serious. Since he had made a payment to the Viet Minh, that indirectly could be considered as financing the Viet Minh. At the time, this would be a very big crime since the South was at war with the North. The whole matter went to court in Saigon and dragged on for several years, during which time my first uncle and especially Uncle Ba Sang had to reduce their business involvement to deal with the matter. Tension was very high during the process. At one point, my first uncle called my grandmother at Chaoyang and asked her to prepare for the worst, because the government wanted to lay charges on the grounds that Chaoyang created a disturbance in the national economy. The maximum penalty at the time was death sentence, plus they could even confiscate all our assets including my grandmother's houses and lands. Sixth Master and Uncle Ba Sang received hints that the corrupt officials at the Ministry of Economy wanted to be bribed to drop the case. Finally, the case went through the court system to the Saigon High Court and even to a court-martial at the end. Thanks to their knowledge of the law and help from Uncle Ba Sang's relatives and classmates, at every step, Chaoyang as well as my first uncle were cleared of any wrongdoing. The International Textile Company also encountered some grave problems that year. On November 1, the government of Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown by a coup d'état. Two of the owners of International Textile, Trong Phung and Sa Keen, were involved with the Can Lao Party, a political party that supported Ngo Dinh Diem. Both of them fled the country after the coup d'état. My first uncle was a pure businessman and apolitical, albeit with his own legal problems, who tried to manage the business as well as he could with the help of Uncle Ba Sang. When Sa Keen came back much later and resumed his duties at International Textile, my first uncle tried to distance himself more and more from the management of the company because Sa Keen was running the business against the principles of my first uncle. But he kept Uncle Ba Sang there to watch for his interests in the company. At about the same time, in 1963, the Cambodian government of Sihanouk, after returning from an official visit to mainland China, suddenly declared that all people who were not Cambodian citizens were banned from practicing 18 business activities, and even nationalized a few. One of the businesses was import-export. We were considered overseas Chinese at that time and not Cambodian citizens. Suddenly overnight, all our imported merchandise was considered illegal. We had to get rid of it fast, otherwise it could be confiscated later. But the market price for imported goods had fallen sharply because every foreign importer wanted to sell. There was so much merchandise invading the market, it was like giving it away. My father and seventh uncle decided not to sell but wait, and sent our merchandise to some friends' warehouses for storage for fear of government raids. The friends took our merchandise, sold it, pocketed the money, and disappeared. As the old Chinese saying goes, in troubled times, you know who your real friends are. We lost everything. We had borrowed money from the Franco-Chinese Bank, later renamed French Commercial Bank of Paris, to finance our import-export business. The bank knew that many importers were in financial difficulty, and called the loan which had been guaranteed by my first uncle. At that time, there was no bankruptcy law in Cambodia. If you owed someone money and you were unable to pay, you could be put in jail. Therefore my parents decided to go back to Vietnam to seek help. One morning in mid-January 1964, my parents, all my brothers and myself, left Phnom Penh for a river town on the Cambodian border. Across the river was Chau Doc, a Vietnamese city about 100 miles northwest of Can Tho. We were looking for a boat to hire to take us across the river, but the Cambodian border police noticed our presence. They stopped us, and since we didn't have visas to travel to Vietnam, they took my parents to the police station for questioning. In separate rooms, the police chief questioned my mother and father, who had made up a story beforehand that we were going to visit my grandmother in Vietnam for the Chinese New Year holiday. The chief asked why we hadn't applied for a visa, and my parents said they were afraid that the application would take too long to process. Since the holiday was less than a month away, we didn't have much time left. At the end the chief asked for a bribe of 5,000 Cambodian riel before he would release us, and my parents had no other choice but pay. Finally, we crossed the river on a small boat in the early hours next morning. We then took a bus to Can Tho where we arrived at about 1 p.m. there. Across from the Can Tho bus station lived my fourth aunt who had a radio repair shop. She was surprised to see us because we hadn't had time to inform the family about our coming. Since we hadn't had lunch yet, she went out to order some takeouts. After we all had lunch there, she took her car and drove us to our grandmother's big house at Kai Rang. 1 month later, my seventh uncle left Phnom Penh and came to join us. I still vividly remember that day of January 1964 when I first arrived at my grandmother's house. After the crowded and animated Phnom Penh which I had left a couple of hours ago, the town of Kai Rang seemed too quiet and deserted, no cars, no motorcycles, a few people on the streets especially around 2 p.m. when it was still the time of siesta. I stood in the courtyard looking at the river passing in front of our house. I started making friends with one of our Chinese neighbors about my age, Hai, whose father used to work for my grandparents and later for my first uncle's rice mill as a cook. We called his father Uncle Lam because they had the same surname as ours. They lived in one of our houses that was right behind the big house. Hai and I were chatting when one of his Chinese friends passed by and asked him in Vietnamese who I was. He told his friend and the boy started teasing me in Vietnamese because he knew that I couldn't understand it. I was angry and turned to Hai and asked him how to say "damn your mother" in Vietnamese. Hai told me, and for that whole afternoon while he was there with us, I called the boy names and cursed him using the first words I learned in Vietnamese. I found out much later that it was his grandfather's brother who had sold the big house to my grandfather almost 30 years before, and they lived just a few houses away. Later we became good friends. That was the first time I really came to know the big house. I had visited it once 4 years before when my parents took us for a trip to Vietnam, but I was too young then to remember anything. It was the largest private residence at Kai Rang. Located at 15 Go Kien Street at the southeastern corner of the town, it was a walled compound sitting on a rectangular lot of about 1 acre, which took up one whole town block. The brick walls at the back were about 12 feet high. At the front was a fence of ornamental scroll design about 7 feet high. The house overlooked the Kai Rang River, which branched through the compound. The compound was composed of 6 buildings, separated in the middle of the lot by a long, open-air corridor running from the front gate to the one at the back. The main building, the residence, occupied about 10,000 square feet, and was on the right-hand side of the corridor. It was a 2-story house of 12 rooms that ran along the outside walls. In the middle was a lot of open space that served as living rooms and altars. These altars were to my grandfather as well as to several different deities of Chinese and Vietnamese culture, such as the god of fortune and the famous Guangdong deity of the Chinese Three Kingdoms era. We were a faithful Buddhist family. Every 1st and 2nd as well as 15th and 16th day of each lunar month, we would make offerings to the god of heaven and earth as well as other deities. The offerings of the 1st and 15th were vegetarian. High on the facade of the building there were 3 words engraved on stone which read, Lam Chi Phat. Chi was my grandfather's name which means a branch of a tree, Phat means prosper or expand. These 3 words formed the name of our house, beneath which, there was a couplet, a traditional feature on the front of a Chinese mansion, formed from last 2 words of the name. It had been devised by my grandfather, an illiterate, and said, the branch creates the weather, which expands and makes prosperous the root. This is perhaps an imprecise translation. Basically, it means that water from the tree evaporates and ascends to make clouds, it then condenses and falls in the form of rain to water the roots of the tree. The water cycle could be compared to the Lam family cycle, where good deeds performed by the family produce good deeds by others in return. In front of the main residence was a concrete courtyard with 2 mango trees, a plum tree and small plants. At the back of the residence was an open area where we had a row of earthen jars used for water storage. There was another building where the kitchen and dining room were located, as well as bathrooms. Several other smaller rooms had served as storerooms and bedrooms for the employees or maids when the house had been used as a rice mill a decade before. At the back of this was a row of 4 separate houses previously used as lodgings for some employees of the rice mill. One of the houses belonged to Uncle Lam. On the left-hand side of the corridor, there were 3 adjacent high buildings of about 4,000 square feet each. That was where our smaller rice mill was located before it was moved to the other side of the Kai Rang River in 1956. After the move, the 3 buildings were used as storehouses. At the back of these 3 buildings were a garage and a garden with more mango trees, a carambola tree and betel palms. The house was so big that my grandmother had raised 4 dogs to help guard it. The first 2 months when we were at Kai Rang, my brothers and I didn't go to school. It was approaching the Chinese New Year, and as the first semester was almost finished, we just stayed home and spent our days playing and exploring the house. At that time, 2 of my 4th aunt's daughters, who were several years older, lived with my grandmother so that they could look after her. My grandmother chewed betel and areca nuts, and oftentimes one of my cousins would prepare them for her. They would put betel leaves and nuts into a small brass cylindrical container, add a bit of lime, and with a small fork, crush the mixture. Then they would give it to my grandmother, who would put it in her mouth, chew it for a while and then spit out the reddish dregs. That was the first time I had seen someone chewing betel. My cousins went to Tan Tru School, which was about 800 feet from our house. We would play together when they came back home. One of the games we liked most was the ox cart game. My grandmother had an old ox cart. At night, my younger brothers and I would sit in the cart and our cousins would push it along the corridor to the front dark courtyard. We had turned off the lights, so we would arrive in the middle of the yard with all the leaves of the fruit trees swinging under the light winds like shadows of spirits. Our cousins would cry out "Ghost," and then abandon the cart with us sitting inside. They would run back to the house, so my brothers and I would scream and hastily get out of the cart and run with them. We would all laugh and then go back to the front to pick up the cart and play again. We played that game for several months until we tired of it. When March came, we started school. My elder brother went to school at Can Tho, and later in Saigon, my younger brothers and I went to Tan Tru School. It was a simple 1-story building within a walled compound. The building contained 6 classrooms. There was also a ceremonial room that had been contributed by my grandfather. His name was engraved on an 8-foot by 2-foot wooden block that hung there. Several other rooms served as lodgings for some teachers and their families, plus there were a dining room and kitchen. In front of the building was a big courtyard that served as the student playground. It contained the basketball court, basketball being the favorite sport of most Chinese in Vietnam. Normally I would have entered grade 3, but the class was full, so I was enrolled in grade 4. All my classmates were quite a bit older than I was. Some were even 7 or 8 years older, since children started school late in small towns. The teaching language was Mandarin Chinese, the same as when we were in Phnom Penh, so there was no problem for us to understand. Even if I did skip one class, I learned fast and was able to catch up easily. Talking with classmates at recess was a problem, for they spoke in Vietnamese. This was a new language for us, even though during the 2 months preceding school, my brothers and I had picked up some Vietnamese at home with our cousins and maids as well as with our neighbor friends. The school day began with Chinese classes from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., then Vietnamese classes from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. From noon to 2 p.m., every school child went home for lunch and a nap, then returned to school from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. for Chinese classes again. All the textbooks were imported from Taiwan. The teaching methods as well as the subjects were of the old-fashioned kind. One of the courses was to learn how to use the abacus. We had to memorize a series of rules that we could sing out like a rhythmic poem. This course, at the time taught by an old gentleman of about 60 years old, was later abolished in the late 1960s. 2 months after we abandoned our operations in Phnom Penh and came back to Vietnam, a fire broke out one night at one of the big reservoirs of the state oil company located just next to our rice mill. The whole town woke to watch the spectacular blaze, which illuminated almost half the sky. My grandmother was scared to death that the fire might spread to our rice mill, for they were so close to each other. She knelt down on the riverbank in front of our house and prayed for heaven's help. We could see the brilliant flames leaping and could feel the heat, even though it was more than half a mile away on the other side of the river. My father and my seventh uncle, along with my sixth uncle, who happened to be at Kai Rang at the time, took several pails and went to the rice mill, to be ready just in case the fire might spread there. Fortunately, after fighting the fire with chemicals for more than 4 hours, the firefighters brought it under control. After the fire, all the rice merchants who used to rent our rice mill to process their rice paddy rushed to purchase insurance coverage for their rice paddy. 2 months later, during a routine religious worship that we performed at our rice mill on every 1st and 15th day of a lunar month, an employee in charge of the ritual forgot to extinguish the candles, and a fire broke out just before noon. Several dozen employees and the people living nearby started fighting the flames before the firemen arrived. The fire was very violent because of the high concentration of the inflammable rice husks, and it took more than 3 hours to put out the blaze. At one point, the firemen had to call in a military airplane from Cantho to help combat the fire with chemicals, just as the oil company had 2 months ago. They feared that our fire might reach the oil company. The blaze destroyed almost half of the rice mill and ruined the bigger machine that could husk more than 60 tons of rice in 24 hours. Fortunately for the rice merchants, their insurance policies covered their losses. It seemed that the fire at the oil reservoir served as a warning. During the Chinese New Year period, Chinese people used to decorate their house with some Chinese blossoms, a kind of flower that the Vietnamese called bong mai. 3 months before, as strange as it may seem, on the very first days of the new year, the flowers at our rice mill all dropped off prematurely. For Chinese people it was a bad omen. 1 month later, the manager of Franco-Chinese Bank came to Vietnam to ask my first uncle for the repayment of our loan in Phnom Penh. My first uncle was the guarantor. Due to the disastrous fire at our rice mill, my first uncle asked them for a delay and did eventually pay back the 3 million piastres loan. We were an honest family, we hadn't escaped from Phnom Penh to get rid of the loan, we came back because our life was threatened by what might happen during that difficult time and we looked for help. That year alone, we lost almost 6 million piastres, from the fire and repaying the loan. As the Chinese saying goes, misfortune never strikes once. With the payment from the insurance coverage, Hao Jiang partially rebuilt the damaged part of the rice mill and my father and seventh uncle started working there for my first uncle. By that time, my sixth uncle, after coming out of China in 1958 and staying in Hong Kong for a year, had returned to Vietnam. At first he worked for my first uncle at the Kai Rang rice mill, then he decided to branch out on his own. He rented my first uncle's former office on Le Quang Lim Street and went into the brand business. He became so successful that later he bought that 2-story office building and rebuilt it into a 6-story split-level house with the whole 5th floor reserved for a ballroom. Life was very simple in this small town during the 1960s. When we came home from school, we would usually go to play and swim with our neighbor friends in the small stream at the side of our house, which was a branch of the big river passing by our front door. We were not allowed to go in the river at that time because we were too small, whereas standing on the bottom of the small stream, water was just up to our chest. The bottom was full of garbage, broken bowls, glass bottles, metal debris, anything you could imagine, therefore we had to put on our plastic sandals so that our feet would not get cut by those sharp things. Even with those hazards, we still enjoyed playing there. That was where we first learned how to swim. At the beginning my grandmother would send one of our cousins or a maid to watch out for us until she was sure that we could swim by ourselves. The stream was very dirty, not only people dumped garbage into it, there was also a public toilet not far from there. Oftentimes we could see human excrement floating by while we were in the water, and we would just step aside to let it pass and then resume our games. When we were older we were allowed to go in the big river in front of the house. It was about 150 feet wide. With our friends we would swim across the river and play the mud-throwing game. We threw mud at each other, being careful not to let it get into our eyes. We would also compete to see who could swim the fastest to cross the river. The current was quite strong and sometimes took us downstream a bit too far and we had to walk back. There was also the danger of many small motorboats traveling on the river, and we needed to pay attention so as not to be hit by them. The two rivers provided us with much joy during our childhood. Life was beautiful, especially when there was no school. We would invite friends to come play marbles in our garden at the back of our house, go catch small crabs when the stream was at low tide, or climb up our carambola tree and sit on the branches chatting with our neighbor friends while eating the ripened fruit. One summer, we decided to organize a basketball team with some schoolmates. We made paper stencils of our numbers and the name of the team in Chinese characters. We then bought colored ink to spray the numbers and name on our tank tops. It didn't look professional, but who cared? We spent almost half that summer preparing the tank tops for all members and only played 2 or 3 games before the summer was over. We never resumed our games after that, but we had enjoyed it. The Mid-Autumn Festival was a big event at Kai Rang in those years, especially for Chinese children. Our school organized a night lantern parade in town to celebrate the festival that occurred on the 15th day of the 8th lunar month in the Chinese calendar. It usually fell in mid or end of September in the Western calendar. We would start to prepare for the festival a month before the parade. In those days, we didn't buy lanterns, we made them ourselves. There were many forms for the lanterns: airplanes, fish, animals, stars, cars, you name it. We used bamboo to build the frame, then we glued on different colored cellophane to cover the frame. As for light, some children used candles, others preferred small light bulbs powered by a battery. On the day of the parade, we would gather in the school courtyard after dinner, chatting and commenting on each other's lanterns while waiting for nightfall. When time came for the parade, we would line up, light our lanterns and march around town with them raised high above our heads to showcase our masterpieces. Townspeople would come out from their houses and watch the parade. When we would disperse later in the schoolyard, everyone would go home and enjoy delicious moon cakes and other sweets that our parents had prepared. The parade was organized for several years until 1968. After the infamous Tet Offensive, it was stopped for fear that the communists would take advantage of the occasion to sabotage. The cricket fighting game was one of our favorites during the summer. We would buy crickets from a merchant or catch them in a field, then put each one separately into its own big matchbox with a small hole on top so it could breathe. We fed them rice and, more importantly, Asian hot red peppers, for it was said to increase their fighting spirit. We would then organize fighting matches between friends. Before putting 2 crickets into a big container for the fight, we would enrage each one by attaching a string to its neck or leg and swinging the cricket to make it dizzy, being careful not to break the leg or neck. Then we would put them down, use a small stick with hairs attached at one end to stir their noses to irritate them, and the fight would begin. If one lost, we would repeat the enraging ritual on the loser, but this time longer and more vigorously, sometimes so vigorously that we would break its neck or leg. At night, we would take the matchboxes with us to bed, but the chirping of the crickets irritated my grandmother so much that she could not sleep, so we had to store them outside the residence. Since we owned a rice mill, we used rice husks as a fuel source for our cooking at home and had a small room at the back of the kitchen to store a couple dozen bags. My brothers and I would invite friends to our house and play a fighting game in the room. We would cover the floor with bags of rice husks, then we would climb up on the piles of bags and jump down on the sacks below and played judo. We had a lot of fun in that small storeroom for several years while we were growing up. The 3 large storage buildings, our former rice mill, also constituted our playing ground. They were used to store rice. In Vietnam, rice used to be bagged in hemp sacks of 220 pounds each. In the warehouse, the bags were stacked up to 10 or 15 per pile. We would climb up on the piles and play, or also play hide and seek. Around 1966, Cantho started transmitting television broadcasts. We were one of the few households at Kai Rang who could afford this luxury. The television sets and the programs, which were broadcast only in the evening, were black and white. At that time, we could only receive 2 channels, one from Saigon, the other from Cantho. Sometimes the signals from Saigon were so weak that we frequently had to adjust the television aerial, which was installed on our flat roof on the second floor, to get a clear picture. Because the house was so big, we needed at least 3 people to relay the messages between the person who was on the flat roof doing the adjustment, usually my 7th uncle, and the one who was in front of the television set to report the results of the adjustment. I remember about 1 week after we received our television, the children from the neighboring houses started to come to our place to watch. A week later, an idea crossed my mind. I had a maid go to the market and buy some raw nuts. When she came home, we roasted the nuts and put them in small paper bags. I then set up a small stand at our back door every evening before the program started, and whoever wanted to come to watch TV had to buy at least a bag of nuts. I was doing that small business for about 2 weeks until one evening my father came home earlier than usual and saw what I was doing. He was furious and told me to stop it right away. He said that those kids were from poor families, they didn't have TV at home, we let them come and watch TV for free, not to make them buy something. I was just doing it for fun, not for money, and besides my price was very cheap, but I did stop it right away. Several years later, almost every house at Kai Rang had TV. That year, I graduated from Tan True Elementary School where my father had become a member of the board of directors. After graduation, since there was no Chinese middle school at Kai Rang, whoever wanted to continue, about half the graduating class, had to go to Cantho. There were 2 schools to choose from, Kai Tri Junior High School or Tho Nan. We chose the latter because it was said it had the better teachers. With half of my classmates from Tan True, we attended the summer classes at Tho Nan to see how the school was. One day upon entering the school gate, we were spotted by a teacher whom the students had nicknamed Heron Lo. Lo was his surname, Heron, because he had a long neck. He was responsible for maintaining general order and discipline in the school. That day he made some comments on our dress and behavior that we didn't like, so with all my classmates, we switched to Kai Tri. The birthday of the Chinese Teo Chew temple's deity was also a big event at Kai Rang. It occurred on the 13th day of the 5th lunar month in the Chinese calendar, around June in the Western calendar. During this event, the town's Chinese community leaders would hire a Teo Chew opera troupe from Saigon to come down and perform for 3 days and nights. People in town would set up an open-air stage near the Kai Rang Pier, just in front of one of my grandmother's many houses, which was rented to one of her friends. My father would have a stand set up at the front door of that house so that the whole family could attend the opera. There were usually at least 2 performances per day, one in the morning, one at night. The dramas were always based upon some Chinese legends or famous historical stories such as the Three Kingdoms, The Journey to the West, and the famous Chinese Romeo and Juliet legend that the Vietnamese called Luong Sun Ba Chuk An Dai, and which they all knew by heart. They would be in Teo Chew dialect, our mother tongue, and were very famous in the Teo Chew community all over the world. Even Vietnamese who didn't understand the dialect attended the opera, some coming from the remote countryside. People from Cantho came because they had no opera there. The night shows starting at 8 p.m. attracted the most people. Long before show time, people would crowd the open space in front of the stage, everyone trying to get the best spot to watch the show. Some brought their own folding chairs, others would just stand or climb up to high platforms or even electric poles. These shows usually lasted until 1 or 2 a.m., one of the few times during the year that people in this small remote town stayed up late. The Vietnamese Halloween was also a special event in town, occurring on the 15th day of the 7th lunar month in the Chinese calendar. It was the day the living made offerings to the dead. Almost every family in town would set up an altar to worship the dead. Amongst the offerings, there were fruits, pastries, rice cakes, etc. After the ceremony, the owner of the house would put the offerings on the floor, then open the door and let the neighborhood children, who were already waiting impatiently outside, come in. They would rush in and grab as many offerings as they could. Then came the most exciting part: the owner of the house would throw money to the children for them to catch. The whole ritual was performed as a symbol of giving the devil something to eat and money for their trip home, sending them back to the netherworld so that the living could have peace all year round. The town itself also organized its own fete in a slightly different way. About 1 week before the festivities, rich families in town would usually each prepare a big, hollow, cone-shaped offering about 5 feet high. Its frame was made of bamboo and covered with paper, and the base of the cone was about 3 feet in diameter. Then people would decorate and hang paper money all around the cone. A Chinese medicine merchant in town might even fasten a few bottles of medicinal oil on it. A big grocery store owner might add a couple of bags of flour. On the day of the ceremony, they would bring the cones to the front of the Chinese Teo Chew temple at the town center where an open-air stage had been set up. Families who hadn't prepared a cone would bring bags of rice, a whole roast pig, baskets of meats and fruits etc. as offerings. All offerings were put on the stage and a number was assigned to each item. Around 1 p.m., townsfolk would gather around the stage, each jockeying for the best position. Then the leaders of the community, which usually included my father, would stand on the stage with a bag of sticks, each with a number on it. They would throw the numbered sticks to the crowd and everyone would try to grasp as many sticks as they could. After the bag was emptied, whoever caught a stick would come forward and receive the corresponding prize. That was one of the big events in town. The Chinese New Year of 1968 became known as the Tet Offensive Year. Tet means New Year in Vietnamese. On the first day of the celebration, the Communist forces of North Vietnam made a surprise general attack on almost all major cities and provinces in the south. Even the U.S. Embassy did not escape the assault. All schools were closed and business activities in the most seriously affected areas were reduced to minimum. At one point, the Can Tho broadcasting station, which was about 2 miles from Cai Rang, was under powerful gunfire. At night we heard cannon shells in the distance, but did not know if the shelling was from the Army of the North or the South or both. When the fighting intensified, we started seeing planes bombing nearby villages and helicopters firing on ground troops. Up to that time, I had never in my life seen real combat except in movies, but here were bombers and helicopters fighting in front of my eyes. With my brothers, we even climbed up to our flat roof on the second floor to watch the airplanes. During the night, the luminous red flashes spurting from the machine guns of the helicopters or from rocket bombs launched by the bombers, became a light show which was terrifying and at the same time amazing to the eyes of young boys. About 3 weeks after the fighting started, refugees began to appear from the remote villages that were the most affected. They came to Cai Rang because it was not directly under fire. Some went to seek refuge at friends' or relatives' houses, others would just sleep in the streets. There were hundreds and hundreds of refugees. Cai Rang was a small town with no hotel or any hospitality facilities. Seeing that, my grandmother voluntarily opened our doors to receive the refugees, since we had 3 big warehouses that were empty at that time. At one point, there were about 200 or 300 people living in our house. Some of them were even the tenants of my grandmother's rice fields or people who had worked for my grandparents a long time ago. We could not supply them food, for there were too many people, but at least we could provide them with a place to sleep and stay. The refugees organized themselves in the 3 storehouses, each family occupied a small corner. They would cover the floor with a reed mat, plastic sheet or the like and sleep on it. Some would prepare meals with a portable kerosene stove, others would simply eat dried food or food bought from the market. During the day, some of the most daring ones would return to their houses to watch for looters and bring back some necessities. They would not stay during the night. Others would just remain in our house and talk about the battle and everything else. I would sometimes go to the warehouse and chat with some boys around my age. There were people everywhere on the floor with baskets, bags, blankets, and clothing all over the place. During the evening, after dinner, some would go smoke cigarettes and pace up and down in our courtyard, others would just sit on the doorstep of the warehouse and listen to the rumbling of cannon in the distance. Life was a bit monotonous for them at that time, for they had nothing to do but sit there and wait for the war to end so they could go home. About 1 month after the arrival of the refugees in our house, the war started to die down. There was still some fighting in the countryside, but the Army of the South had regained most of the lost land. Some refugees started to return home, but there were still about 100 who stayed on and didn't want to leave. One day, out of the blue, my grandmother asked all the refugees to leave our house and return to their own homes. She told them that the war was winding down and there was no more reason for them to stay on. They should go home and leave our warehouses now. Some of the refugees were angry at my grandmother. Others even treated her as inhumane to ask them to leave, for the war was still going on in some parts of their home territories, although not as intensely as it had been. But my grandmother was firm in her request. They started to pack up and leave our house, albeit reluctantly. By the end of the next day, the 3 storehouses were empty. It was quite a change of scenery, when just a couple of days ago, there were hundreds of people crammed in these places. 2 nights later, Kai Rang experienced one of the fiercest artillery attacks in its history. The shelling started in the wee hours and we all jumped out of our beds and crawled underneath to seek cover. The pounding of cannon lasted for almost an hour, then we heard the air raid siren for another half hour before everything calmed down. That night our house was seriously damaged. One shell hit one of the bedrooms upstairs and went through the wall, leaving a big hole on it. My father was sleeping next to that bedroom and ran down the stairs in no time. Another shell hit the front warehouse from the outside wall and exploded inside, and the rear warehouse received one right on top of its tile roof. The next morning, when we sifted through the rubble to inspect the damage around the house, we were just thankful that the 3 warehouses had been empty the night before. Otherwise we would have been haunted all our life by people who might have been wounded or dead because we hadn't asked them to leave in time. Tragically, one shell hit Uncle Lam's house and took the life of one of his daughters. When some of the refugees heard what had happened to our house and especially to our warehouses, several of them came to personally thank my grandmother for her premonition and to say that they felt sorry for what they had said about her. After the bombardment, we decided to build a small shelter in the house. We had 2 large, hard plank beds at home, each measuring about 7 feet wide by 8 feet long and 5 inches thick. The beds were about 3 feet off the ground on the ground floor. My 4th brother and I slept on one of them, the other was for my 3rd and 5th brother. We decided to build the shelter on that one. We put several layers of bags of rice husks on top of the bed so that it could absorb the shock of a shell. We also put bags of rice husks under and around the bed to make it a closed area. We left only a small entrance so that we could crawl inside when we heard the bombing. Inside we put pillows and blankets on a reed mat on the floor. The shelter became one of our playgrounds. We would hide inside when we played hide and seek, and my brothers would sleep inside even on normal nights with no bombing. Sometimes Hai and his brother would come over and sleep in the shelter with us because their house was less resistant to the bombing. Hai was in the same class as I was, and sometime we would take our flashlights inside the shelter to study and prepare for our exams. As children, we still managed to have some fun during those worrying wartime days. After we built the shelter, we never used it for its intended purpose, and finally in mid-1969, dismantled it. That summer, I graduated from Kai Tri and was enrolled at Tho Nan, the only Chinese high school at Can Tho. From the original dozen classmates of Tan Tru who attended Kai Tri, we were now 4 left to attend Tho Nan: my best friend, Tan, 2 girls, Hon and Hua, and I Heron Lo. The teacher who had driven us away when we first attended the school 3 years ago, was still there and holding the same position. Around this time, now that my only sister, Dai, who was 4, was old enough to go to school, my mother decided to start her own rice business with money invested by several relatives and family friends. The rice business was labor-intensive and dusty. It all began with the purchase of paddy rice from the farmers, which was transported to the rice mill to be husked. After being husked, it produced rice and byproducts such as rice husks, bran, etc. The paddy rice had to be dried before passing through the mill. During sunny days, people covered the ground with a canvas or plastic cover, poured on the paddy rice and spread it to dry in the sun. When there was a big order, the rice mill ran 24 hours a day over several weeks. After my elder brother graduated from high school, he joined my mother and worked in the rice mill, too. By the end of 1970, her business was doing so well that my first uncle decided to invest in her company and boosted the business with this new financing. Meanwhile, my seventh uncle had started his own trucking business with 2 trucks, carrying goods from Cambodia to Saigon and back. Also, at this time, my father suddenly decided to abandon all business activities and turn his interests to gardening. In fact, he was really not cut out to be a businessman. Even in those years in Phnom Penh when my mother went to join him, she saw that he was not very capable at managing my first uncle's business, and that is when she began to become involved. My grandmother had a piece of farming land at Ap Ton Mai, a hamlet located about 1 mile southeast of Chaoyang. My father started growing oranges, guavas, mangoes and other vegetables there. Most of the harvest we consumed ourselves or gave to friends and relatives. He also planted 3 dozen pots of flowers and small plants in our front yard. My grandparents owned about a dozen houses at Chaoyang. They were even part owner of the town's only movie theater, which had stopped functioning as such and had been left unattended long before I arrived in town in 1964. Their houses were rented mostly to friends or former employees. We didn't even collect rent on some, such as the house of Uncle Lam. We let them live in those houses rent-free because of their loyal service to our grandparents. On others we just collected a nominal rent. I didn't know that until I was old enough to collect rent for my grandmother. Every first of the month, my father would prepare the receipts and I would ride my motorcycle to those houses to collect the rent. There was the photographer where I had had my picture taken, the bicycle repair shop where we would go with a flat tire, the barber where my father had his hair cut, the jeweler, and so on. Each house was rented for a paltry sum of 200 to 300 piastres, just enough for a couple of bowls of morning noodle soup, but my grandmother was happy with that. She never exploited anybody in her life. After I had finished my rounds, come home and given her the money, she would take out a portion, divide it and give it to my brothers and me as our pocket money. She always gave me the biggest part because I was the one who collected the rents. The anniversary of my grandfather's death, on the first day of the 12th lunar month, exactly 1 month before the Chinese New Year, was a big family event. 1 week before the celebration, we would start to prepare. My second and fourth aunt living at Cambodia would come in and help my grandmother to make many kinds of Vietnamese pastries. Then 2 days before the celebration, we would start preparing the main dishes and several of my grandmother's friends or their children would come over and help. The celebration lasted 2 days. The first day was more of a family festivity with, according to Buddhist tradition, all foods being vegetarian because it was the first day of a lunar month. Early in the morning, my grandmother, my mother and their friends would start to cook the food they had prepared. Around 10 a.m., most of my aunts, uncles and cousins would arrive, except for those who lived far away in Saigon. We would make offerings to my grandfather, the foods were set up at his altar located at the center of the main residence, and each of us would burn joss sticks and kowtow in front of his altar. After the religious ceremony, we would set up several tables, one for women, one for men, 1 or 2 for children, and we would have lunch. The adults would chat about the old good days and those relatives or friends who could not attend. We children would quickly finish our lunch and go to play in the back garden. In the afternoon we would start to prepare for the bigger celebration the next day, when many of the people who used to work for my grandparents or my first uncle, as well as those who still worked at our rice mill, were invited. The second day's offerings were the opposite of the first day's, with lot of meats such as steamed duck, roast pork, sweet and sour fried shrimp, beef sautéed with vegetables, chicken with bamboo shoots and abalone, as well as the traditional shark's fin soups served in almost every Chinese feast. There were at least 7 or 8 courses including cold dish appetizers. The next day, all the kitchen helpers would come over early in the morning. The whole roast pig that we had ordered directly from the slaughterhouse would have arrived around 10 a.m. Then we would prepare for the offerings and worship because the guests would soon arrive. There were relatives, family friends, our rice mill's former and current employees, people who used to do business with our family, about 70 or 80 people. We usually set up 3 big tables in the front living room for the male guests and about 4 or 5 tables in the rear dining room for the relatives, women and children. My brothers and I would serve the 3 tables in front and the maids would take care of the tables at the back. Each front table was supplied with bottles of hard liquor such as whiskey or cognac. There was beer and soft drinks for the women. People would drink and eat and chat, and my brothers and I would grab something to fill our stomachs in between each course we served. The festivity would last for about 2 hours, then the men would have dessert and cigarettes and settle into long conversations about the rice business. The women would then catch up on the gossip in town, and we waiters would have our lunch. By 3 p.m., all the tables were cleaned and dishes washed. Then came the food distribution. By Chinese tradition, during a festivity such as the birth of a child or anniversary of death, the family would distribute roast pork, red-colored boiled eggs and other foods and pastries to relatives and family friends. My grandmother, mother and aunts would prepare several big baskets with each portion packed separately, and my brothers and I would take our bicycles or motorcycles and go distribute the foods. Since we were a well-known family in town, there were many families who had a relationship with us. My brothers and I would usually make 4 or 5 rounds to distribute all the food. Then come the preparation for the Chinese New Year. My brothers and I would have to go early to the tailor to have some new shirts and pants custom made, for the end of year was the busiest period for all tailors. People rarely bought clothing in Vietnam at that time, they had them custom made. Sometimes they bought shirts, but they always bought custom-made pants. My grandmother would also start preparing foods for the new year. First she would order thousands of rice papers, which the Vietnamese called bon trang, from a lady merchant living just across the street at the back of our house. I always went to see her prepare them, a kind of round, flat, thin pancake made of rice flour. The merchant would mix a big basin of rice flour with water and salt or sugar, depending on whether we wanted salted or sweet. An earthen pot of boiling water had been covered with a sheet of clean cotton cloth. She poured a ladle of the mixture onto the cloth and let it steam for a minute or 2, then took it off. We could eat it right away when it was hot and wet, or let it dry under the sun so that it could be stored for a long period of time. Later, when we wanted to eat it, we would usually grill it over a charcoal oven so that it became crispy. It was eaten as a snack during the New Year period. My grandmother would also prepare some homemade Chinese sausages and shrimp cakes, as well as some Vietnamese pastries. I remember always helping her make the sausages and shrimp cakes because it was easier. After she stuffed the pig intestine with meat, I would use a tool with many small, pointed pins at one end to puncture some tiny holes in the sausages, then I would take them to our front yard to let them dry in the sun. My grandmother would stock up a great quantity of watermelons, at least 30 or 40. Tradition says good fortune will come to those who eat watermelon during New Year, because of the red color of its meat, which is the color of luck for all Chinese. Besides, at that time, watermelon was in season only during the New Year period. New Year's Eve was a busy day. We would all wake up early in the morning, for there were many things to do before dusk. My grandmother and mother had to prepare foods to make offerings to ancestors and heaven and earth. My brothers and I would iron our new clothes, take out and polish our shoes, which we only put on for special occasions such as weddings and the New Year holiday. My father would choose one of his best pots of Chinese blossoms to put in the front living room. The whole family would have the reunion dinner around 7 p.m. That was one of the most important dinners in the year for Chinese people. By tradition, all members of a family would come home for this dinner if at all possible. After dinner, the children would gamble and play cards. We played gourd crabfish tiger, a sort of Vietnamese dice game. We would also receive the traditional red envelopes of money from our grandmother, our parents and seventh uncle. The next morning, I would wake up around 5 a.m. to prepare to go with my father to make offerings and worship at the Chinese temple in town. This was a family tradition, the first thing we would do on the first day of the sacred Chinese New Year. At home, my mother would also make offerings to my grandfather and at other altars where we worshipped other deities. Coming home, we would have breakfast and then put on our new clothes and shining shoes. My father and seventh uncle would also put on their ties to wait for one of the big events of the day, the traditional Chinese unicorn dance. The dance was held to chase away devils and bring luck and prosperity to the family. The Kai Rang Unicorn Dance Team was made up of residents of the town, who performed only during important events such as New Year, religious celebrations, etc. The first place that the team performed was the Chinese Teo Chew temple, or more correctly, they had to go there to worship first, then they could begin their performing trip. After the temple, the dance team went to perform at the Chaoyang district chief's office, which also served as his house. Then they came to our house, the first civilian house where they would perform, always in that order, even though our house was located at a corner of the town. We would hear the unicorn team coming from far away with the pounding of their drum, gong and cymbals and all the noise of the crowds that followed them. We would open our big front gate, and my father and seventh uncle would stand in the courtyard to receive them. After inviting the team leaders into the antechamber while the team began the dance in the courtyard, my seventh uncle and we children would go upstairs to prepare the money for the unicorn to eat, a traditional Chinese custom whenever there was a unicorn dance. We would fasten a string to the end of a long bamboo cane, then tie paper money all along the string at an interval of 2 or 3 inches. From the second-floor balcony, we would push out the bamboo cane and raise it high enough so that the unicorn could not touch it from the ground. After performing the dance on the ground for a while, the team prepared to eat the money. Around 7 or 8 people would raise a pole about 20 feet high and hold it firmly on the ground. Then the unicorn dancer would climb up the pole and perform the dance on top, with his feet standing firmly on 2 small bars. Sometimes he would lie flat on his belly on top of the pole and make a 360-degree turn to impress the children below. That would be the climax of the unicorn dance. Then the drum would change to a rhythm for the preparation of the money-eating process. After the dancer made several pretend attempts to catch the string, the drum would begin a swift and dense rhythm that was the signal to catch and swallow the string. After getting the money, the dancer would slide down the pole and perform a last dance before leaving for other houses. At each house, the unicorn dance would usually take about 5 to 20 minutes to perform, depending upon whether the host offered the money-eating process or not. After the unicorn team left, my seventh uncle would take pictures of all my brothers and sister in front of the residence. This tradition lasted for the many years we were in Vietnam until the communists took over South Vietnam. The whole family would usually stay home that day. Because my grandmother was well respected in town, people younger than she who had a relationship with our family would come over to our house and wish her a Happy New Year. My aunts and uncles as well as many of my cousins who lived at Cantho would also come. The next couple of days, my brothers and I were rarely home. If we were not going out to play with friends or going to their houses, we would be going to the movies at Cantho. Sometimes we would even see 3 movies in one day since there were 5 movie theaters at Cantho. That was what most young people would do during the New Year holiday in this small town. Outside of our front wall, there usually were several gambling stands set up by traveling gamblers. People would gather around the stands and play cards or dice games. Sometimes I would stand inside our house and hand money out to play because my father didn't allow us to gamble with strangers. I graduated from Tho Non in 1972 with a Chinese high school diploma. There were no Chinese universities in Vietnam, so if I wanted to go to a Chinese university, I would have to leave Vietnam and go to Taiwan or Hong Kong. The Vietnamese educational system didn't recognize Chinese diplomas, and because of my age, I was only allowed to attend grade 10 in the Vietnamese system. Therefore, Tan and I switched to Lasan Can Tho, a Vietnamese high school run by the Christian Brothers, and entered grade 10. In Vietnamese high schools, students attended classes only half-day, either in the morning or in the afternoon. At Lasan, the school only had classes in the morning, the afternoon was reserved for catch-up classes or things like that. After the signing of the Paris Peace Accord in January 1973 in preparation for the ending of the Vietnam War, my first uncle had a premonition about the future of the country. One day several months later, he told my mother that he wanted to cease his participation in her company and withdraw all his investment. In fact, he wanted to stop all business activities in Vietnam. My mother had no other choice but to return all his money. At that time my sixth uncle's brand business was doing so well that he decided to take my first uncle's place and invest in my mother's rice business, so the company kept going. During the Chinese New Year festival of 1974, my fifth aunt who just emigrated from China to Hong Kong came to visit us. She urged us to prepare for the worst because she felt that South Vietnam would not stand long under the peace accord. In early March 1975, the North launched its final attack on South Vietnam. It all started with the fall of Ban Mi Thuot City in the Central Highlands on March 10, 1975. Then Quang Tri, Hue, Phan Ran, Phan Thiet, and Da Nang fell on 29 March. The South Vietnamese army fled, taking along hundreds of thousands of civilians who were trying desperately to move further southward. By early April, it seemed that the no-turning point had already been reached, the South would be taken over by the North. We heard from relatives in Saigon that many people were looking for ways to flee the country. At the time, I was in the midst of preparation for the Vietnamese baccalaureate exam that would be held in June. The school had organized intensive classes in the afternoon to prepare the students for that important official final high school exam. On 20 April, we decided to look for a way to leave the country. I dropped everything and went with my seventh uncle to Saigon to stay at my sixth uncle's house. Upon entering Saigon, one could easily feel the chaotic atmosphere in the city, whereas at Can Tho, even in the last days of the war, everything had still seemed very quiet with no sign of panic at all. Maybe that was because of our ignorance of the seriousness of the situation or because of the calm and competent leadership of the 4th Military Region that was headquartered at Can Tho. I will never forget the panic scenes in Saigon at that time. On every corner of the streets, every noodle stand, every café, people were talking about plans to leave the country. Many embassies of the Western countries that we tried to visit had already closed their doors. Every day we saw cars and taxis carrying people and luggage to Tan Son Nhut International Airport. At the U.S. Embassy, hundreds of people lined up or gathered in front of the courtyard waiting for a piece of valuable paper that would allow them to leave the country with the Americans. On 21 April, South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thu resigned and left the country a few days later. My first uncle, with his kidnapping experience of 1949 still vividly pictured in his mind, knew that his life might be threatened by a takeover of the South by the North. He tried to leave for Hong Kong by boat via Vung Tau, a coastal city east of Saigon. He waited until 23 April in Vung Tau, but there was still no sight of the promised boat. That day, my fifth aunt had flown in from Hong Kong to see how the family was doing. Finally, with my sixth uncle, they asked my seventh uncle to drive a car to Vung Tau and bring back my first uncle and his wife the next morning. The situation became tenser with each passing hour. Fortunately, in the end, with a Canadian laissez-passer provided by one of their daughters who had been sent to study in Canada a couple of years before, my first uncle and his wife were evacuated by the Americans on the morning of 25 April. That afternoon, my fifth aunt returned to Hong Kong, because it was now too dangerous to stay on. Meanwhile, my sixth uncle, seventh uncle and I, as well as a close friend of my uncle's, Mr. Thang, were trying desperately to find a way to leave, to no avail. We even went to the port of Bac Dang in Saigon on the 29th to see whether we could embark on a ship. Not a chance. Finally, on April 30, 1975, Saigon began to fall to the North Army. Seeing that there was no way we could leave the country from Saigon, we decided to go back to Can Tho and try to escape by sea from the Mekong Delta. Mr. Thang's brother had a contact at Ha Tien, a remote coastal village at the southern tip of Vietnam that led to the Gulf of Thailand. The next morning, 4 of us traveled back to Can Tho in my sixth uncle's Toyota. We had been in his house for nearly 24 hours because of the curfew order. On 1 May 1975, the streets of Saigon were full of military uniforms, equipment and weapons left overnight by the soldiers of the South Army. Passing through some streets, I even saw hand grenades lying by the roadside and nobody seemed to care. By looking at people's faces, the whole city seemed to be in a joyful mood, but who knew what people really thought in their minds? Driving down from Saigon to Can Tho on National Route 1, we encountered traffic jams at strategic spots. Busloads of passengers were trying to get to the Mekong Delta, some buses with passengers even sitting on the roof. Who knew where these people really wanted to go, back home after the end of the war, or were they trying to find a way to flee the country as we were? Approaching the Mai Thuan ferry, one of the 2 ferries that we had to take in order to get to Can Tho, the traffic was so heavy that it took us more than an hour to travel the 10 miles that led to the boarding point. We drove, we stopped, we drove and stopped again. The car engine was so overheated that my sixth uncle had to use ice wrapped in a piece of rag to cool it. Finally we arrived at the ferry boarding point. During my 12 years of living in the Mekong Delta, I had never seen anything like what I saw at that moment. There were hundreds and hundreds of trucks, buses, cars, motorcycles, tricycles, people coming from all directions trying to get on the ferry boat. The noise of the engines, the horns and the shouting were overwhelming, everybody struggling to move forward to get on the ferry. It was a big mess at the boarding point. I got out of the car and walked to the front, trying to assess the situation. There were several North Army soldiers standing there trying to maintain order and direct the flow, but they seemed to be having difficulty getting people's attention. Maybe because they were new to the country, no one paid much attention to them, or maybe they were not using the right method. Somehow, without listening to the soldiers' orders, everybody just kept moving ahead when there was no space to move. Standing in the road was a soldier, holding a rifle in one hand and directing traffic with the other. He signaled to the driver of one of the overcrowded buses to stop. He wanted to let a truck coming from the side get through so that traffic on the side road could be cleared. The bus driver ignored his signal and kept inching ahead. Finally the soldier was fed up. He put down his AK-47 assault rifle before the bus's front wheels, crossed his arms and just stood there looking at the driver through the windshield, without saying a word. The driver finally stopped the bus without daring advance any further. Every vehicle came to a standstill with everyone watching the soldier and the bus driver. The soldier kept his eyes on the driver and waited for about 1 minute, then turned and signaled the truck driver from the side road to pass. Then he picked up his rifle and signaled the bus to advance. It was amazing to see how a North Army soldier dealt with this kind of situation. If it had been a South Army soldier, he would have already fired several shots in the air to give warning to the bus driver. Here a North soldier just put down his rifle and said nothing, and the problem was resolved. Finally we arrived home around 6 p.m. It had taken us almost 9 hours for a normal trip of 6 hours. After arriving home, we found out that even though Saigon had surrendered at noon on 30 April, the soldiers stationed at Cai Rang had resisted until late into the night. The next morning around 8 a.m., we left Cai Rang discreetly, taking my fourth brother with us. We arrived at Mr. Thang's brother's house in Rach Gia around noon. Rach Gia was the main city on the road to Ha Tien. We stayed there for the night, and the next morning, Mr. Thang, his brother and my sixth uncle traveled by bus to Ha Tien to reconnoiter. The next day before noon, Mr. Thang's brother came back and told us that it was all right to go. But before that, my fourth brother and I had to have a haircut, because there were several checkpoints on the road where the North soldiers didn't like youngsters with long hair. They would make them get off the bus and have their hair cut on the spot before letting them continue their journey. We set out for Ha Tien in the afternoon, passing through several checkpoints. We arrived safely at Ha Tien around 6 p.m. and stayed in the house of a friend who used to travel to Thailand by boat and smuggle merchandise. There were already about 30 other people in the house, all waiting to escape the country. 2 days later, around 9 p.m., in groups of 2 or 3, walking slowly as if we were taking a stroll, we arrived at a pier, boarded a fishing boat with about 60 other people, most of whom had come from Saigon, and set sail for Thailand. At the last minute, my seventh uncle and my fourth brother decided to stay and not to come with us. We reached the high seas around dawn without any incident. It seemed that the new authorities didn't know that people were using this route to flee the country. On the boat, there were mostly Chinese businessmen from Saigon, with a few officials of the old government and their families, a Saigon city councillor, a member of the lower house, and a lieutenant colonel who used to serve as a military attaché for the embassy of South Vietnam in Bangkok. At noon, 2 days later, we reached the coast of Thailand. We decided to land on an isolated island and wait until nightfall to get to the small coastal town of Klong Yai. After having lunch, some went to swim in the ocean, others had a nap in the shade of the tropical trees. Around 3 p.m., a Thai Navy destroyer spotted our presence and approached the island. We all were scared since we could be sent back to Vietnam by the Thai authorities. Everyone climbed up a small hill at the back of the island to hide. We saw sailors land on the island and move closer to the hill, then we heard an officer speak in English through a megaphone, asking all of us to come down, ensuring us that we would not be sent back to our country. As we had no place to hide, we all finally came down and boarded the destroyer, which took us to Klong Yai. The Thai authorities in town didn't know what to do with us since we were the first wave of the Vietnamese refugees later known internationally as the Boat People. They settled us in a house belonging to a local wealthy Chinese businessman. From there we contacted Mr. Thang's elder sister who was living in Bangkok and she came to visit us at Klong Yai 2 days later. We didn't want to wait in this small town for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to find a settlement for us. Since there were several police checkpoints on the way from Klong Yai to Bangkok, we decided to hire a smuggler to help us to slip into the capital. 2 days later, through a local Chinese, we made arrangements with a Thai smuggler and moved into a small hotel. He came to meet us around midnight at the hotel but told us we could not go yet because at one of the checkpoints, the captain in charge was unexpectedly on duty. We had to wait until he went home to sleep before we could go. Finally early in the morning, so as not to draw the attention of the townspeople, we chose to walk out of town. Then a car drove by and picked us up. We passed several checkpoints with no problem and by the end of the afternoon, arrived in Bangkok. According to my knowledge, I was the first person in Cai Rang to leave the country after the takeover. 2 months later, my sixth uncle and Mr. Thang settled in Hong Kong. I emigrated to Paris, France, at the end of October 1975 and stayed there until I moved to Montreal, Canada, in 1984. Meanwhile at Cai Rang, the family lived quite a normal life in town until September 10, 1975. That day, the government started the so-called Beat the Capitalists campaign. Around midnight when the family was asleep, they suddenly heard the dogs barking and someone shouting and banging at the front gate. My father went out to see what was happening. There were about 30 soldiers, armed to the teeth, asking to enter the house. Some of them were even equipped with bazookas. Bazookas. What were they expecting? A guerrilla war? They ordered everyone to get out of bed and line up in the main living room, where their leader read a prepared speech, declaring that since the family was capitalist, all their assets would be confiscated by the government. He then asked my parents to hand over all gold and money that they kept in the house. Since they didn't keep much gold at home, they handed over what they had, but the soldiers didn't believe my parents, and started searching the house. By daybreak, it was known that the army and the public security forces equivalent of the police had made simultaneous visits to all the wealthy Chinese families at Chaoyang that night. Since the house was big, it took them 10 days, exactly 10 days, to search, during which time they stayed in the house day and night. They looked into every corner of every room. All family members were closely watched. When my brothers needed go to the market to buy groceries, a guard would accompany them to make sure they didn't take any gold to hide at a friend's house. Every night all family members would sleep in the rooms that were assigned to them. There was an old-fashioned safe of my grandfather's generation to which we had lost the key more than 15 years before, but the safe was still in the house because it was heavy and we didn't know what to do with it. The soldiers saw the safe and thought that the family kept their gold and money in there. They asked my father to open it, but he told them they had lost the key and there was nothing inside that was valuable, just some old papers and documents. The soldiers didn't believe him and insisted upon having it opened. My father had no choice but to hire a locksmith from Cambodia to try to open it. After more than 3 hours of trying to pick the lock, to no avail, the locksmith had to cut off the door. The soldiers found exactly what my father had told them they would find. After the soldiers finished the search, the family was expelled from the house. Each member was allowed to take only a few clothes, some necessities and kitchenware, an allowance of 50,000 piastres per person, and a total of 110 pounds of rice for the whole family. My mother and seventh uncle were held in custody in a school serving as a temporary jail. With them were other business people of the town, most in the rice business. They were all waiting further investigation because they were considered capitalists. My father had withdrawn from business activities long ago, so he was spared detainment. Instead, he was sent along with my grandmother and all my brothers and sister to populate the so-called New Economic Zone, which meant remote rural areas with nothing but rice fields and woods. That day was September 20, the Mid-Autumn Festival of 1975. It is a day, in the Chinese tradition, where all members of a family return home, if they are away, and have a reunion. The day of the displacement, a truck waited in front of Tan Tru School to load the whole family. While waiting for the departure, my sister, who was only 10 years old, was spotted by one of her favorite teachers, Mrs. Pham, who was also a family friend. Mrs. Pham decided to try and take my sister so she wouldn't have to leave. She asked several of my sister's best classmates to pretend to play near the truck. They helped my sister to slip down off the truck and circled around her so that the public security forces would not notice. Then they pretended to play together and run away. Later, in order to hide her, the teacher took my sister to her hometown of My Tho, about 40 miles west of Saigon, and took care of her until my family was allowed to come back to town several months later. She also helped keep some valuables during the family's absence and returned everything when they came back. My family was grateful for the help of such a kind friend. In the meantime, several family friends in town started to gather around the truck to bid farewell to my family. They brought them gifts, because they knew that they were poor now. One gave several bottles of soy sauce, others brought a couple of bags of flour and sugar, because it was not easy to buy those things in the new economic zone. One of my fifth brother's friend even took off his gold necklace and threw it onto the truck, saying to my brother, "Take it, just in case you need it." My brother threw it back to him and thanked him so much, for he could not accept that kind of handsome gift, especially during this period of time when everyone was facing a difficult life. The family found out later that they were the only family in town amongst the dozen who were sent to different new economic zones who had this kind of warm farewell from the people in town. People were still bringing things when the wheels started rolling. Nobody except the family and friends noticed that my sister was missing. The truck took the family to Phung Heap, a small town about 18 miles from Chaoyang. From there they boarded a small boat and traveled another 4 hours to reach their destination, because there was no road that led to this place of nowhere. There were about 2 dozen thatched houses in this small village. After getting off the boat, the public security forces led the family to one of the houses that had been abandoned by people who had fled the war a long time before, and said that would be their new home. They warned the family not to go to certain places and pointed out where there were leftover land mines. The empty, battered shelter had no beds, no furniture, not even a stove for cooking. The house was uninhabitable. My father had no choice but to go begging at a neighboring house. Fortunately, the owner had mercy on the family after seeing my old grandmother and agreed to let them share a corner of his house and lend them a bed. Because there was no market in this settlement where they could buy food, every day my brothers would try catching some fish with a used net that they bought from a villager. They had never gone fishing like that in their life, but somehow they succeeded in catching some fish every day. They would cook the meals using the stove of the owner of the house. At night my brothers would sleep on the floor, leaving the bed for my grandmother. The villagers were very ingenuous and gentle, but there was nothing my family could do in this area except fish and farm, and it was far from any town. Meanwhile, our big house in Kai Rang had been taken over by the government and turned into the headquarters of the Chao Tan district's public security forces. All our other houses and lands, as well as the rice mill, were expropriated by the government. While my mother and seventh uncle were detained in the school jail, the government of the town tried to organize a public trial at our rice mill. One day they set up a table in front of the office, gathered all the employees of the rice mill and asked them to denounce our crime. For several minutes, there was only silence in the crowd, because people in the South were not used to this kind of public denouncement, not like the Northerners during the 1954's takeover of North Vietnam. Then suddenly, one employee stood up and talked. He told the official who presided over the public trial that my family had never exploited anybody in the rice mill nor had we done anything bad to people in town, that we always treated people generously and kindly. There was nothing else he could say. Other employees nodded in agreement. The trial lasted less than 10 minutes. My family was always generous to people in need. When I was a student at Lassen Can though, there was a classmate who was a boarding seminarian at the Kai Rang Seminary. He attended classes at Lassen because the seminary did not offer classes for those students who wanted to major in mathematics. While at Lassen, he fell in love with a girl one class below ours and decided to quit the seminary. His problem was that he had no money to rent a room once he left the seminary. He asked me if my family could provide him with free lodgings until he could find a place to stay. When I went home and asked my father, he agreed without hesitation. The student lived and ate with us for almost 1 month, then he was accepted as a boarder by the Christian Brothers at Lassen. Finally, after almost 2 months living in the new economic zone, the rice ration that my family had taken along was gone and it was difficult to get a new supply. Meanwhile, after investigation, the authorities found that my mother and seventh uncle had never done anything harmful to the people in town or to the new government and were released from the school jail. Taking advantage of this opportunity, my mother asked the People's Committee to allow my family to relocate to our land at Ap Ton Mai, near Kai Rang, where my father used to grow fruits and vegetables. The committee accepted her request and issued papers for her to move the family to the farm. The family was finally reunited on our own land. During those difficult years afterward, the whole family worked in the fields. They grew fruits and vegetables as a means of subsistence, some to live on and the rest my fifth brother would sell at the Kai Rang market. Oftentimes they had difficulty make ends meet each month. They even had to chop wood to be used as fuel for cooking, because they had no money to buy kerosene. At night, my third, fourth and fifth brother had to sleep at Tan Tru, the Chinese school in town which later was also seized by the government. This was because the house on the farm was too small to hold everybody, and they didn't have money to extend it or build another one. Fortunately, there was help from several family friends in town. Upon returning from the new economic zone, my grandmother went to the market one day to buy some kitchenware from a merchant that we had known for decades and used to buy from. He didn't want to take the money, and told my grandmother, "Grand auntie, take it home, you pay later." One of the truck drivers who used to work for my seventh uncle's trucking company became a butcher after the war and lived midway between Saigon and Shantou. One day, he came to visit at the farm, bringing with him many pounds of pork, a gift for his now poor employer's family. When my fifth brother went sell their produce at the market, oftentimes people bought it without bargaining, which was very unusual in Vietnam. The family was deeply touched by the generosity and kindness of friends during the most difficult time of their life, and began to realize that it was because our grandparents, parents, as well as aunts and uncles had always treated people in town with generosity and kindness. Not everyone would extend a helping hand, though. 2 years later, seeing that life was becoming more and more difficult in Vietnam, my mother decided to send my grandmother to Hong Kong so that my fifth aunt and sixth uncle could take care of her. All visa applications had to be approved by the provincial authorities before going to Saigon for central government approval. We had a family friend who was a good friend of the assistant director of the public security forces at Shantou. The family asked him to help us and he refused. Having no other choice, my mother, although she could not speak Vietnamese fluently, had to do it herself. She made several unsuccessful attempts to meet the assistant director before he finally agreed to receive my mother. She told him that since my grandmother was old, my mother was asking him to help get her permit signed so that my grandmother could go to Hong Kong to see her offspring there and have a better life for the rest of her days. After listening to my mother's request, the assistant director agreed to help her and asked her to come back the next week to get the permit. Before sending my mother out, he even praised her for her filial duty toward my grandmother. 6 months later, my grandmother left Vietnam for Hong Kong. She was the first person in town who was allowed to leave the country by official means. Meanwhile in Vietnam, the semi-opened Great Exodus of boat people was reaching its peak in 1978. It was called semi-opened because the government, although they would not admit it internationally, would allow people to leave the country openly by boat if they could pay a specified fee, usually in gold. They would even have the public security forces escort the boat people out to the high seas to ensure safe passage out of the country. Even though my family didn't have the money to pay the specified fee, thanks to our established relationship with the assistant director of the public security forces at Shantou, my parents were able to secure a place for the whole family on one of the boats. They helped its owner register his boat with the government for an exit permit. It took almost 8 months to prepare the boat for the journey because the owner needed to collect enough money to repair it. At the last minute, before boarding and sailing off, my father and my seventh uncle decided to stay on. My seventh uncle even accompanied the family out to the high seas to make sure that everything was all right, and then returned to port on the public security boat that had escorted the refugees. The 80-foot-long by 20-foot-wide boat with 350 people on board sailed for almost 1 week before arriving at the infamous Pulau Bidong Island off the Malaysian coast. Several times during the trip, they encountered Thai pirate boats. At one point, one of the pirate gangs even demanded that all the young male refugees move over to one of the pirate boats so that they could search the refugee boat without fear of resistance. Fortunately, every time, after searching for money, jewelry and gold, and getting what they wanted, they left without doing any harm to the boat people. The family stayed on Pulau Bidong Island for about a year and finally went on to Montreal, Canada, in April 1980. 8 years later, my father came, too. Now, over 50 years after the Chinese Communists took over China and more than 25 years after the fall of Saigon, how is the family of Lam Chi doing? Of those who were in China, my mainland grandmother passed away in 1964. When she died, the family in China was so poor that my little uncle had to remove some wood from the ceiling of my great-grandmother's shrine to make her coffin. Because of the financial and legal problems that the family in Vietnam and Cambodia had encountered, we were not able to send money in time. My third aunt, after graduating from her accounting class, went on to work for a branch of the People's Bank of China at Guangdong. Later she married an officer from the People's Liberation Army, and had one daughter. She is now retired and lives in Shantou. Her daughter lives in Hong Kong. My fifth aunt, after graduating from the Foreign Language Department at Beijing University, worked as a Chinese-Vietnamese interpreter for the Chinese Foreign Ministry. She married a colleague who was also a Chinese-Vietnamese interpreter and has one daughter. Her whole family came out to Hong Kong in 1973 and emigrated to the U.S. in 1979. She is now retired and lives in New York City. My little aunt also went to university in Beijing. Later she became a doctor and also married a People's Liberation Army officer. They had 2 sons. She is now retired and lives in Beijing. Her 2 sons live in Montreal, Canada. My third uncle, after graduating from his accounting class and working briefly in China, slipped out to Hong Kong in 1963. Without seeking help from his family in Vietnam, he managed to survive on his own. In the early 1980s, he worked as an accountant for his father-in-law's lumber company, then he started one of his own. By the early 1990s, he was so successful that he started building a plant in China employing hundreds of workers. He has 2 sons and 2 daughters. My little uncle became a farmer after the takeover of China and remained as such until he passed away in 1999. He is survived by his wife, 2 daughters and a son. They still live at my grandfather's house in China. After arriving in Hong Kong in 1978, my grandmother lived with my fifth aunt until she emigrated to the U.S., then my grandmother moved in with my sixth uncle. She passed away in Hong Kong in 1981 at the age of 88. She was buried in China near my grandfather's tomb. My first aunt died long before I arrived at Kai Rang. She is survived by 3 daughters and 4 sons, most of them now living in the U.S. and Hong Kong. My uncle married a second wife who has 2 sons, and they live in the U.S. My second aunt emigrated to Australia in the early 1980s. She has 3 daughters and 4 sons who live in the US, France and Australia. My fourth aunt still lives in Vietnam at Phat Not where she settled in the early 1970s. She has 4 sons and 4 daughters. Some live in the US, others still live in Vietnam. After being evacuated by the Americans during the last days of Saigon, my first uncle and his second wife moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where they lived with one of their daughters. He had 3 daughters and 2 sons with his second wife, and their children live in the US and Canada. With his first wife, he had 1 son and 1 daughter. The son was declared missing in Cambodia during the Pol Pot regime. The mother and daughter live in Hong Kong. My first uncle passed away in Boston in 1984. After settling in Hong Kong in 1975, my sixth uncle applied for his wife, daughter and 5 sons to join him there. He had done some business in China during the 1980s. He is now retired and lives in this Chinese Special Administrative Region. My seventh uncle still lives on our land at Ap Ton Mai, Kai Rang. He married in 1982 and they have no children. He is now the chairperson of the management committee of Kai Rang's Chinese Teo Chew Temple, to which my grandparents as well as many of their children have contributed greatly. The temple was seized by the government in 1975, and returned to the people in 1991. I graduated from Paris Dauphine University in 1982 with a master's degree in computer science. After working briefly for a subsidiary of France Telecom, I moved to Montreal in 1984 to join my family. Concerning our properties, after China became more favorable toward the overseas Chinese and especially after opening up to the Western world in 1978, the government started to give back our houses one by one. When the shrine my first uncle had built for my great-grandmother was returned to the family in the mid-1980s, it was terribly damaged. It had been used by farmers as lodgings and they hadn't taken care of it. My third uncle spent more than 50,000 Hong Kong dollars to renovate it. In Vietnam, of all our properties that were confiscated by the government, some have been sold, while others are still under the control of the government. International Textile Company was seized by the government after the takeover of 1975. One night, the government came to Uncle Ba Sang's house, and asked him to bring along a mosquito net and blanket to attend a working session. They took him to a seized Chinese school in Saigon, where they detained and questioned him for 10 days. Then he was released and hired by the government to help run the plant. He stayed on for 2 years and retired in 1977. Today International Textile has been renamed Viet Thanh II, part of the Viet Thanh Textile Company. One of the things that I regret the most was the loss of all our photographs. According to what our friends told us later, several weeks after my family was expelled from our house, government personnel moved in and began to empty the place. They threw all of our pictures into the Kai Rang River that flows in front of the house. Many of our souvenirs were lost forever, including a 3-by-6-foot framed photograph of my grandfather where he was standing and holding his walking stick. Most of the old family photos in this book came from my third and fifth aunt who had kept the pictures we sent them almost 50 years ago. Those of my school days, I borrowed from my friend Tan. Almost all other people mentioned in this book have emigrated overseas. Sixth Master lives in Montreal, Canada. Uncle Ba Sang emigrated to Chartres, France. Mrs. Pham lives in Chicago with her whole family. My friend Tan lives in Calgary, Canada. Wah, as well as the man whose granduncle sold the big house to my grandfather, are in San Francisco. Hon is in Taiwan. Hai is in Missouri with his brother and mother. Today, more than 3/4 of all the Chinese families who used to live at Kai Rang in the 1960s have emigrated overseas or at least had a member of their family go. The Chinese school has been converted to a Vietnamese one and is still under the control of the government. Looking back at all those difficult years in life, we feel lucky to have suffered little damage other than the fortune that we worked hard to build. The Chinese used to say, "Wealth is the object outside of your body." It means it is much less important than your health and your life. Today, almost all members of the Lamchi family enjoy their life in a free world. We may not be as rich as we used to be, but we have more than enough to provide for our needs, and above all, we have to some degree fulfilled our grandfather's dream. The branch creates the weather, which expands and makes prosperous the root. I still remember vividly the first morning on the boat that took my sixth uncle and me out of the country 25 years ago. The sun was shining on the Gulf of Thailand. Standing on the deck looking at the ocean, I could see, far ahead, a row of seabirds flying freely in the sky, toward an unknown place full of adventure. Suddenly, I had a strong feeling of my grandfather. More than half a century ago he was standing on the same sort of boat, looking out of the South China Sea, not very far from where I was, dreaming for a brighter future in a foreign country, hoping to spread his family and make it prosperous. Who says history doesn't repeat itself?